Look up at the moon tonight and you'll see the same thing humans have seen for hundreds of thousands of years. Cold, silent, familiar. But here's the thing. For most of human history, almost nobody actually believed that. Philosophers, priests, astronomers and emperors all looked at that same pale disk and saw something else entirely. A world, a god, a monster mid-swallow, a warning written in fire and shadow. And the strangest part? Some of them were closer to the truth than we ever gave them credit for. Tonight we're going back through 7 of the strangest, most unsettling ideas humans have ever had about the moon. A Greek philosopher who insisted the moon was basically Earth's twin, with valleys and living creatures centuries before telescopes existed. A group of ancient scribes convinced the moon was breaking its own cosmic laws, drifting off schedule as a sign the world itself was cracking apart. Babylonian priests who read lunar eclipses like death warrants for kings. A dragon in China that ate the moon every so often, and somehow an entire empire organized itself around making sure it spat it back out. We'll get to all of them, slowly, piece by piece. So if you're the kind of person who likes falling asleep to a story that quietly rewires how you see the sky, you're in the right place. If you're using this to drift off, that's exactly why I make these. So go ahead, subscribe, and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is right now. I genuinely check the comments. It's wild seeing Sydney at sunrise and Chicago at midnight, all listening to the same voice in the dark. And if you want to support the channel without spending a cent, following on Spotify and leaving a 5-star review helps more than you'd think. Links in the description. One more thing before we start drifting through history. If you love mysteries like this one, I put together a book covering 12 unexplained mysteries from around the world. You can grab it on the website, links in the description too. Now, let's talk about a Greek philosopher who looked at the moon 2,000 years ago and said something that should not have made sense. And somehow it kind of did. His name was Plutarch, and by the time he sat down to write about the moon, he was already one of the most respected minds in the ancient world. Born around 46 AD in a small Greek town called Chaeronea, he lived most of his life doing something that sounds almost quaint by today's standards. He watched people, he studied history, he tried to understand what made humans tick, and he wrote it all down with a kind of patient, curious honesty that made him famous across the entire Roman Empire. Most people today know Plutarch, if they know him at all, from his parallel lives, a massive collection of biographies comparing famous Greeks and Romans. Alexander the Great gets paired with Julius Caesar. Theseus gets compared to Romulus. It's the kind of work that shaped how Western civilization thought about leadership, virtue and ambition for the next 2,000 years. Shakespeare practically lifted entire scenes from Plutarch when he wrote his Roman plays. Founding fathers in America quoted him when they were arguing about what kind of government to build. This was not some fringe thinker scribbling in the margins of history. This was a man whose words carried weight. But here's the thing about Plutarch that most people never learn in school. He wasn't just a biographer, he was also a priest at the Temple of Apollo in Delphi, one of the most sacred sites in the ancient Greek world. He held political office. He travelled to Rome and Egypt, soaking up ideas from every philosophical tradition he could find. And underneath all of that public life, he had this other side, a restless curiosity about the natural world that pushed him to write essays on subjects most people considered strange, even dangerous. One of those essays survives today under the title On the Face in the Moon. And if you've never heard of it, you're not alone. It's obscure even among people who study ancient philosophy. But it might be one of the most fascinating pieces of scientific speculation to come out of the ancient world, precisely because of how much it got right and how differently it got there. See, Plutarch wasn't working with telescopes. Galileo wouldn't point one at the moon for another 1500 years. Plutarch didn't have access to anything we'd recognise as an instrument for studying the sky. What he had was observation, logic, and a willingness to argue against the most powerful scientific consensus of his time. And that consensus, coming largely from Aristotle and his followers, said something very specific about the heavens. Everything above the moon was perfect, unchanging, made of a mysterious fifth element called aether, completely different from the messy, decaying, imperfect matter that made up the earth. The moon, the sun, the stars, all of it existed in a realm of cosmic perfection, smooth and eternal, nothing like the cracked and weathered ground beneath human feet. This idea wasn't just popular, it was foundational. It shaped astronomy, religion, and philosophy for centuries. Questioning it wasn't just intellectually risky. It bordered on questioning the entire structure of reality, as most educated people understood it. And Plutarch looked at that idea and essentially said, "I don't buy it." Why does his essay matter so much? Because On the Face and the Moon isn't really a scientific paper in the way we'd think of one today. It's structured as a dialogue, a conversation between several characters, debating what the moon actually is. This was a common format in ancient philosophy, letting different voices argue different positions, so the author could explore an idea from multiple angles without necessarily committing to just one answer himself. Plato did it, Cicero did it, and Plutarch used the format brilliantly, letting his characters go back and forth about astronomy, mythology, and physics, weaving them together in a way that feels surprisingly modern. Through these characters, Plutarch raises a question that must have sounded almost heretical to some of his contemporaries. What if the moon isn't some perfect alien orb of divine light? What if it's actually more like Earth? Not identical, but similar in fundamental ways. A solid body, a place with its own geography, maybe even, and this is where things get really interesting, a place capable of supporting some form of life. This wasn't idle speculation thrown out for shock value. Plutarch built his argument carefully, using the kind of reasoning that would make a modern scientist nod along, even if the conclusions eventually diverge from what we now know. He pointed to the moon's surface markings, the shadows and light patches visible to the naked eye, and suggested they indicated real physical features. Mountains, valleys, maybe even bodies of water. He argued that if the moon reflected light the way Earth's surface did, and if it had a solid, uneven terrain the way Earth did, then the most logical explanation was that the moon was made of similar stuff to our own planet, not some mystical, perfect substance reserved for the heavens. This mattered enormously in the context of his time. Ancient astronomy wasn't just about tracking dots of light across the sky. It was deeply tied to philosophy and theology. If the moon was made of ordinary matter, similar to Earth, then the entire hierarchy separating the heavens from the Earth started to crumble. If the moon had geography, valleys and highlands and dark, shadowed regions, then maybe the line between our world and the cosmos wasn't as absolute as everyone assumed. Plutarch was essentially suggesting that the boundary between earth and sky, between the mundane and the divine, was far blurrier than official philosophy wanted to admit, and he was doing it not as a rebel scientist working in isolation, but as one of the most respected intellectuals of his era, someone whose opinions carried real cultural authority. When a man like that starts questioning the perfection of the heavens, people listen even if they don't necessarily agree. So what exactly did Plutarch claim was up there, on that pale glowing surface? What did he think those shadows and markings actually represented? That's where his essay gets genuinely strange, and genuinely ahead of its time. To Plutarch, the face in the moon was not some random smudge of light and dark. It was evidence, a pattern, a clue about what kind of world the moon might actually be. He starts with the same thing every human culture has noticed. When you look up at the full moon, you see a kind of face, or at least a set of shapes that our brains can't help turning into eyes and a mouth. Some people see a rabbit, some see a woman, some just see blotches. Plutarch saw continents. In the dialogue, one of his characters insists that those dark patches are not tricks of the eye, not illusions produced inside the viewer. They are fixed, permanent features on the moon's surface. The fact that the pattern doesn't change as the moon waxes and wanes, only the edge of the illuminated part, tells him something crucial. Whatever is causing those markings is carved into the moon itself, the way mountain chains and seas are carved into earth. He looks at the contrast, bright regions and dark regions, sharp boundaries between them, the way some dark areas seem rounded and enclosed while others stretch out like plains. From that he spins a picture. The brighter areas, he suggests, are like highlands or exposed rock, places where the moon's material is dry and reflective. The darker ones are like basins, low-lying regions that hold denser, heavier stuff, deep valleys, chasms, possibly even lakes or seas. He even plays with the idea of depth. The deepest parts of the dark patches, in his imagining, are like abysses where the sun's light barely penetrates. Not because the light is weak, but because the terrain is so uneven that sunlight gets trapped, scattered, blocked by towering ridges and jagged cliffs. The result seen from Earth is a permanent shadow. This is where Plutarch starts to sound unnervingly modern. He compares the way the moon looks to the way distant mountains appear on Earth at dusk. From far away, our own rugged landscape can flatten into silhouettes of light and darkness. You don't see every tree and rock, you just see broad masses, bright and dim. To him, the moon is doing the same thing. We're so far away, so limited in our vantage point, that the fine details blur into general regions of light and shadow. But the underlying structure, the idea of a rough, varied surface, remains. He's not content with just saying, "There are spots up there." He wants to know what they're made of. One character suggests that the dark regions are deep hollows filled with some kind of mist or vapour, like valleys on Earth filled with clouds at dawn. Another speculates that they are actual seas, lunar oceans made not of fire or ether, but of some heavier substance, perhaps even water or something comparable. The bright regions would then be the dry land rising above these lunar waters. An entire geography. Coasts, gulfs, promontories, islands. At the same time, he's aware that if the moon has chasms and cavities, that raises questions. Why don't we see them changing? Why don't clouds form and dissipate the way they do on Earth? Here, the dialogue format lets him explore multiple answers. Maybe the moon has its own kind of air, but it's thin and subtle. Maybe its seas are calm and slow to move. Maybe the scale is so vast that the changes are invisible to us, unfolding over spans of time longer than a human life. He also notices something about the way the moon shines. When the Earth is between the sun and the moon, during an eclipse, the moon doesn't glow with its own light, it darkens. That, for him, is another clue. The moon reflects light, it doesn't produce it. And if it reflects light unevenly, with some areas brighter than others, then its surface must be uneven as well. Smooth, perfectly polished spheres don't throw back patchy reflections. Rough ones do, worlds with mountains and valleys do. He even toys with the idea that the moon's interior might be lighter than its exterior, almost like a shell surrounding emptier spaces or less dense material. The deep eyes of the face, the darkest spots, could be great openings, mouths of enormous chasms plunging downward. The lighter areas are where the crust is thicker, the shell more solid. It's not a perfect picture, and from a modern standpoint a lot of the details are off, but the instinct is the same one later astronomers would follow with telescopes and measurement. take the visible patterns seriously and ask what physical structure could create it. Underneath the poetic language, there's a simple, stubborn idea. The moon has terrain. It's not a disk painted onto the sky, not a lamp hung from some crystalline sphere, but a place. Somewhere you could, at least in principle, stand, look around and see horizons, cliffs, lowlands stretching out into the distance. And once you start thinking of the moon as a place with mountains, valleys, and maybe even seas, another question follows quietly, almost inevitably. If it has geography, what else might it have? For Plutarch, the next step is as bold as it is quiet. If the moon has geography, maybe it also has inhabitants. He never pounds the table and declares, "There are people on the moon," the way a modern headline might. Instead, he lets the possibility seep in through the edges of the dialogue. If the moon is Earth, like, he asks, if it has land and sea, if it has light and dark, heat and cold, if it occupies a middle region between the fiery sun and the heavy, changeable earth, wouldn't it be strange if it were completely barren? One of his speakers suggests that the universe is not wasteful. Nature does not create habitable places for nothing. If there is a third kind of world between the mortal earth and the divine heavens, perhaps there are also third-kind beings, neither gods nor ordinary humans, living in that in-between place. Not angels, not exactly, but something like celestial neighbours. They might have bodies of lighter stuff, breathe a thinner air, live longer lives under slower, gentler conditions. They might look at us the way we look at the deep sea, distant, obscure, interesting, but not central. He even wonders what their day and night would be like. From the moon, Earth would loom huge in the sky, going through its own phases. To those hypothetical dwellers, we would be the bright, changeable disk, swelling and shrinking, sometimes vanishing altogether. Our storms, our oceans, our continents would be wrapped in cloud, but the patterns of light and dark would still be there. Just as we read the moon's face and imagine its terrain, they might read Earth's face and imagine ours. Viewed from our time, it's tempting to read all of this as simple fantasy. But the way later thinkers handled Plutarch's lunar world tells a stranger, more layered story. When Renaissance scholars rediscovered these texts, they were already living in a world starting to crack open. Telescopes were still in the future, but skepticism toward the old crystal sphere cosmos was growing. For some readers, Plutarch looked like a prophet of the new astronomy. Here was an ancient writer saying, "The moon is solid, scarred, Earth-like, perhaps even inhabitable." They treated him as a kind of proto-scientist, someone who had glimpsed, with naked eyes and sharp reasoning, what instruments would later confirm. You can see the echoes. When Galileo first pointed his telescope at the moon and saw mountains, shadows, roughness, he described them in language that could have sat comfortably beside Plutarch's. Craters like bowls, ranges like the Apennines, bright peaks catching the sun while surrounding regions lay in night. Later readers looked back at On the Face in the Moon and said, he was onto it. He intuited the basic fact, the moon is a world. Others went in almost the opposite direction. For them, Plutarch's lunar Earth was too daring to take literally, especially in a universe still supposed to reflect divine order and hierarchy. So they read his dialogue as allegory, a philosophical fable where the moon is not really a physical place but a symbol, a teaching device. In that reading, the face on the moon is like the face of the soul. The bright regions are reason, clarity, the higher faculties. The dark regions are passions, ignorance, the lower appetites. The chasms and abysses are the depths of human nature, the parts of ourselves where light has difficulty reaching. When Plutarch talks about a middle world between heaven and earth, allegorical readers hear him talking about the human condition itself, suspended between animality and divinity, pulled in both directions. Even his speculation about lunar inhabitants became, in the hands of some later Platonists and Christian writers, a way of talking about intermediate beings, not literal moon people, but spiritual intelligences, daimonic forces, souls in transit. The geography becomes psychology. The craters become moral landscapes. The whole essay turns into a map of ascent and descent, of how souls move between higher and lower states. Early modern natural philosophers tried to split the difference. They didn't want to give up the scientific promise in Plutarch's reasoning, but they were also aware of his taste for myth and story. So they labelled him, sometimes admiringly, sometimes with a hint of condescension, as a kind of physicist in disguise, someone doing natural science under the cloak of mythic narrative. They pointed out how he reasons from observation, the fixed pattern of lunar markings, the behaviour of light in eclipses, the analogy to distant mountains on Earth. These are empirical moves, hypothesis building from visible evidence. At the same time, they admitted that his conclusions slide into territory no telescope had yet reached. Inner hollows, airy seas, strange inhabitants. For them this was not a failure but an example. Plutarch showed how imagination and observation could work together, how you could start with data and then let the mind wander carefully into the unknown. Modern historians of science tend to be more cautious. They resist the urge to claim Plutarch as a straightforward ancestor of contemporary astronomy. They emphasize that he was writing inside a Platonist, symbolic universe where every physical question was also a metaphysical one. On this view, the essay is deliberately double-coded. It is both about what the moon might be and about how we think, how we project, how we fill in the dark spots with our own concerns. In other words, the ambiguity is the point. Plutarch's moon is allowed to be two things at once, a potentially real rugged world and a mirror for human thought. And that, strangely, is why his warning still lands today. Because whether you read him as proto-scientist or allegorist, he is doing something unsettling. He's telling his readers that the most familiar object in the night sky is not what tradition says it is. It is not a perfect heavenly lamp, not a polished sphere attached to a crystalline shell. It is not simple, not smooth, not purely symbolic. It is complicated, irregular, potentially inhabited, potentially meaningful at more than one level. He is, in effect, warning them that the cosmos has layers. That if the moon, the gentle guiding nightlight of farmers and poets, turns out to be a scarred, Earth-like body with a possible face and a maybe population, then nothing in the sky can be taken for granted. The boundaries between worlds are thinner than they look. The line between myth and measurement is blurrier than anyone wants to admit. Later ages would turn that warning in different directions. Some took it as encouragement. If the moon is a world, perhaps we can go there. Perhaps the universe is full of neighbours. Others took it as a more sobering message. Our symbols are not safe. The things we use to steady ourselves, the steady phases of the moon, the presumed perfection of the heavens, can be overturned by closer inspection. Somewhere in the middle of all this, if you're curious to go further, there's a whole chapter on ancient lunar riddles, including Plutarch's is in the little book about 12 unexplained mysteries we've put on the website. The link is waiting in the description whenever you feel like exploring. For now, though, let Plutarch's voice fade a little, the arguments soften at the edges, and just hold on to the feeling his essay leaves behind. A sense that the moon is not just a background ornament, but a question, a riddle written in light and shadow, asking us who we are, what counts as a world, and how many other faces might be looking back across the darkness. Plutarch handed that question forward. Centuries later, other writers would do the same, but with a very different kind of warning. Instead of imagining the moon as an Earth-like twin, They worried about what it meant when its behaviour seemed to change, when its light, its path, its very law no longer matched the pattern they thought had been set at the beginning of time. 2. The Enochic luminaries and the moon's changing law. To see that, we have to leave the marble libraries of Plutarch's world and go somewhere older, stranger, and much more anxious about the sky, into the Book of Enoch. If Plutarch is a philosopher looking up at the moon and wondering what kind of place it might be, the author of 1 Enoch is doing almost the opposite. He treats the heavens not as unexplored territory, but as a system that is already built, already legislated, already under supervision. In his vision, the moon is not just a light in the sky. It's an official, a civil servant of the cosmos, one of the luminaries of heaven that has been given a law, a schedule, and a duty. The section that lays all this out is usually called the Book of the Luminaries, or sometimes the Astronomical Book. It's about 2,500 years old, maybe a little more, written in a world where the movements of the sky were not just interesting. They were how you kept sacred time, how you knew when to plant, when to fast, when to celebrate, when to mourn. It opens not with poetry, but with something that feels remarkably like a textbook. An angel, Uriel, takes Enoch on a tour of the cosmos. Not the poetic, mythic cosmos we might expect, but a very technical one. There are doors and portals and fixed points. There are angles and numbers. There is a repeated insistence that things move according to their law. The sun has its law. The stars have theirs, and the moon unusually has a complicated one. For ancient Israelite writers, time was not just what happens next. Time was covenant, obligation, memory. Festivals tied to harvest cycles, Sabbaths repeating every 7th day, Jubilees cycling every 49 years. To keep that sacred rhythm, you needed a calendar that could tell you when the new year began, when the new moon fell, when the equinox arrived. The Book of the Luminaries is, on one level, an attempt to write that calendar into the sky itself. It describes a 364-day year, 12 months, each 30 days long, plus 4 extra days tucked in at the turning points of the seasons. A neat, square, almost perfect structure, 52 weeks exactly. A year that always begins on the same weekday, that never drifts, that feels designed rather than improvised. To make that work, the author has to choreograph sun and moon together. The sun in his system marches through 6 gates in the east and the same 6 in the west. As it rises through one set of gates in summer and another in winter, the length of the days expands and contracts in a predictable pattern. No surprise there. Many ancient cultures noticed the sun's shifting, rising points along the horizon. The moon is where things get intricate. In the Book of the Luminaries, the moon waxes and wanes by measured increments. It gains light in fractions, loses it in fractions, appearing and disappearing in a carefully numbered sequence. It travels through the same gate system as the sun, but not in lockstep. Sometimes it's in front, sometimes behind, sometimes it lines up, sometimes it doesn't. The text lingers on those differences like a scribe hunched over a table, trying to force messy reality into clean columns. On paper, the scheme is beautiful. In this divinely ordered calendar, festivals always fall in the right season. Passover never drifts into winter. Harvest feasts never slip into the wrong part of the year. Lunar months and solar years aren't at war with each other. Everything is synchronized through a higher pattern, a design that human beings can trust. This was not an abstract obsession. In the period when 1 Enoch was taking shape, different Jewish groups were competing over how to keep time. Some relied on an observational lunar calendar, watch the first crescent, declare the new month, adjust as needed. Others, like the community behind the Dead Sea Scrolls, were fiercely attached to a fixed solar-based calendar, that matched the 364-day scheme in Enoch. For them, the stakes were enormous. Get the calendar wrong, and you weren't just celebrating on the wrong day. You were out of sync with the angels. You were breaking the appointed times set from the foundation of the world. The Book of the Luminaries enters that argument by claiming that its calendar isn't just clever. It's revealed. Enoch doesn't sit down with a clay tablet and start calculating. He is taken, in vision, through the machinery of the heavens. Uriel explains, step by step, how many days the sun rules alone, how many days the moon shares its light, how long each phase lasts. The language is dry and repetitive, almost hypnotic, as if the safest way to talk about the sky is to turn it into a litany of numbers. And underneath that dryness, there is a quiet insistence. This is how things are supposed to be. The luminaries have been given justice and order. They are faithful servants, not wandering, unreliable gods. They keep their appointments. They run their courses. They make it possible for humans to live inside a world that is fundamentally rhythmic and trustworthy. At least that is how it is meant to work. But as the Book of the Luminaries unfolds, a tension starts to appear. The author seems to know, in the background, that the moon does not always behave the way his scheme would prefer, that the neat 364-day year doesn't quite match what you actually see when you stand outside and watch the sky. He pushes that problem away at first, burying it in tables of days and fractions of light. Yet the unease is already there, the sense that the moon of all the luminaries is the one most likely to slip, to drift, to threaten the system by not obeying its law perfectly. In the next part of this story, the text will stop pretending that everything is perfectly aligned and start whispering something more unsettling, that when the moon's path doesn't match the pattern, it isn't just a mathematical inconvenience. It looks, in Enoch's world, like a sign that someone somewhere is watching and correcting. In Enoch's vision, that sense of correction starts with architecture. The heavens are not open sky, they are gridded. Over and over, Uriel shows Enoch gates in the east and west where the great lights enter and exit. The language is stubbornly concrete. The sun does not just rise, it comes forth through the fourth gate, or returns and enters the sixth. The moon does not simply appear at dusk, it goes out by the first gate in the west and returns by the fourth gate in the east. Every crossing has a number. Every number has a rule. This is not empty ornament. In the ancient Near Eastern imagination, gates mean control. City gates have guards. Temple gates have priests. Palace gates have officials who decide who gets in and who stays out. To talk about gates of heaven is quietly to talk about supervision. The luminaries are not free-floating bodies wandering a cosmic wilderness. They pass through checkpoints. They are routed. They are, in a real sense, managed. The text makes that management explicit in a way that's easy to miss when your eyes start to glaze over from all the counting. For each gate, Uriel tells Enoch how many days the sun uses it, how the length of day and night change, how many parts of light the moon borrows or returns. When the moon is late, the text does not shrug and say, well, the moon is complicated. It says that its light is taken away or added. It treats discrepancy as an event. Someone, somewhere, has decided how much light the moon is allowed to have, and for how long. Later Jewish and Christian readers would sometimes imagine angels pushing the spheres or guiding the stars. In 1 Enoch, you can feel that idea still half hidden, like a watermark behind the numbers. Uriel isn't just explaining physics, he's explaining policy. He tells Enoch that each luminary keeps faith, that they do not transgress their path, that they do not leave their order. These are moral verbs, the language of covenant and obedience. In a world where kings demand tribute and priests insist on correct sacrifices, the sky itself is described as a place where obedience is monitored. which means by implication that disobedience is possible. The Book of the Luminaries hints at that possibility with a strange phrase that repeats enough times to become unnerving. The sun and moon, it says, follow their law, but they have also been given a command not to alter it. They have a law, they could, in principle, break it. Most of the time the narrative reassures you that they do not. The sun runs exactly, without deviation. The quarters of the moon are specified so tightly that the waxing and waning become like a liturgical pattern of light and dark. But then you get little slips, passages that admit the moon anticipates the sun or falls behind it, sentences where Uriel pauses and says that in certain months the moon varies from its normal measure. In some manuscripts the scribe adds marginal notes, as if trying to fix something that no longer quite matches what he sees outside his window. The result is a subtle doubling. There is the ideal motion, the law as it should be, and then there is what actually happens, which sometimes looks like the law being bent back into place. Enoch's tour makes that bending sound deliberate. He is told that the luminaries cannot shorten their service and cannot overstep their appointed course. The verbs are strong. Not do not, but cannot. Not merely descriptive, but enforced. The sense is that if anything begins to drift, pressure is applied. The law asserts itself, or is asserted on its behalf. You can hear beneath the droning rhythm of days and gates an older fear that if nobody watched, the sky might come apart. Ancient farmers did not need an angel to tell them that the moon sometimes rises at inconvenient times, that eclipses cut holes in its face, that a harvest might come late even when the phases say it is time. They lived in that tension every year. The Book of the Luminaries responds not by erasing the tension, but by wrapping it in supervision. It imagines the moon as a somewhat unreliable official under a very reliable bureaucracy. When it anticipates, that anticipation is noticed. When it lags, the lag is counted, measured, brought under rule. The gates and fractions become a kind of cosmic audit. Every moment of misalignment is recorded, explained, folded back into a declared order. This is where the language of sin and transgression begins to seep in around the edges. Elsewhere in 1 Enoch, the great sin of the fallen angels is that they abandon their proper place. They leave their station. They cross a boundary that was not meant to be crossed. Cosmic rebellion is described as a kind of illegal movement. Read against that backdrop, the Luminaries section starts to sound less like a neutral manual and more like a quiet reassurance. The moon is not one of the rebels. Or, if it ever starts to look that way, something is in place to pull it back. The text never says outright that there are guards at the gates, or that Uriel and his colleagues have to intervene. It doesn't have to. The entire structure implies it. You don't build corridors and limit access, unless you expect, at least in principle, that something might try to slip through the wrong door. For later readers, that implication raised as many questions as it answered. If the heavens need regulating, what does that say about the stability of creation itself? If the moon can vary and be corrected, who decides what counts as variation, and what counts as disobedience? Is every strange moon an accident or a message? Those questions echo faintly in other traditions too. Babylonian omen lists, Chinese eclipse stories, Mesoamerican codices that treat the darkening of the moon as a warning. Different cultures, different images, but a similar unease. When the sky behaves oddly, someone is either very displeased or very busy. Somewhere in the middle of all those worries and speculations, people like us kept trying to map patterns anyway. To take comfort in rules, even while suspecting that something or someone stood behind them. By the way, if you ever want to drift off with more of these puzzles in mind, there's a little book of 12 unexplained historical mysteries waiting on the website linked in the description. It's there when you're curious, but you don't have to move a muscle right now. Because in Enoch's world, the moment you ask whether the moon can disobey, another question quickly follows. What happens when it does, or when it seems to? In the next part of this story, the Book of the Luminaries will edge closer to that cliff and start to treat irregular moons not just as scheduling errors, but as signs that the boundaries between heaven and earth may be thinner and more fragile than anyone is comfortable admitting. One of the reasons interpreters argue about all this is that the Luminaries section can be read on at least two very different levels. On the surface, it looks like a calendar manual, a ritual tool. You can imagine a priestly group under the Second Temple, frustrated with a lunar calendar that seemed to drift, convinced that the festivals were sliding off their proper dates. For them, the night sky isn't abstract. If Passover or the Day of Atonement falls on the wrong day, the entire covenant schedule feels out of tune. Read from that angle, Enoch's law of the moon is a way to protect sacred time. The intricate lists of days and fractions become a quiet protest against chaos in the liturgical year. The gates and measures define a 364-day solar calendar that, in theory, never wanders. The moon in this reading is not the master clock. It is an indicator that has to be aligned with a higher standard. When the text says the moon varies, a ritualist hears a practical problem. If the observable moon no longer matches the ideal schedule, which do you trust, the eye or the revelation? The answer the Luminaries seems to offer is firm. You trust the revealed pattern. You treat the sky as if it's supposed to look like the heavenly template, even when it doesn't. If the moon deviates, you do not move the feast. You wait for the bureaucracy of heaven to bring the luminary back into line. On that reading, those little corrections are a kind of liturgical shrug. Yes, the moon gets ahead or behind. No, that does not change the calendar. The temple service follows the law written in the book, not the fluctuations written in the clouds. Some scholars see here the fingerprints of a specific community, the sort of people who would later gather at Qumran by the Dead Sea. The scrolls found there preserve solar calendars, sharp critiques of what they call a lazy or confused temple priesthood, and repeated insistence that the festivals must be kept on the right ordinance. For such a group, one Enoch's luminary laws would have been comforting. The cosmos itself, they could say, secretly agrees with our schedule. If the public calendar seems off, it is the priests who are out of step, not the heavens. But there's another way to read the same passages. Instead of asking, how do we fix the calendar, you ask, what kind of universe needs this much supervision? On that level, the Book of the Luminaries becomes less a handbook and more a piece of cosmic political theory. The sun and moon are not simply clocks here. They are officers. They have a service, a station and courses that they are bound not to overstep. When Enoch is told that they keep faith and do not transgress, you're hearing the same vocabulary used elsewhere for covenant obedience, royal loyalty, legal compliance. The heavens, in that imagination, are structured like an ancient kingdom. There is a high king who issues laws, chief ministers who interpret them, and officials who carry them out. The luminaries are visible reminders that law in this universe is not just a human invention. It is woven into the movement of time itself. Scholars who emphasize this side of the text talk about cosmic governance imagery. The point of the numbers is not just when to celebrate a feast, but who is in charge of the world. In that view, the occasional variation of the moon is not merely a scheduling issue. It is a narrative moment you are allowed to see, just for a second, what happens when a subordinate drifts. The language of cannot shorten, cannot overstep, is the language you use when someone, somewhere, might be tempted to do exactly that. So the calendar talk doubles as reassurance. If anything begins to slide, there is a mechanism and a will to push it back. This has consequences for how the book imagines human history too. If the moon has a law, and the stars have paths they dare not cross, then Israel's own law and its own boundaries are not arbitrary. They mirror something cosmic. Ritual timekeeping and cosmic governance start to blur. To keep the feasts on the right days is to cooperate with the order of creation. To mistime them is not just an error, but a small act of misalignment with a much larger structure. That may be why later interpreters could read ominous meaning into irregular skies. If you live in a universe where law runs from heaven down, a moon that refuses to match the template can look like more than an astronomical quirk. It can feel like a sign that the usual lines of authority are under strain, that the guards at the gates, whoever they are occupied with something larger or are deliberately letting a signal through. Other cultures told that story more bluntly. Babylonian Omen collections spelled out which royal disasters might follow a haloed moon. Chinese records speak of dragons taking bites out of it. Mesoamerican priests watched for darkened discs that meant gods were displeased or hungry. The Enochic writer is subtler, but the anxiety is similar. By wrapping the moon's motion in the language of law, command, and obedience, the text makes every irregularity an implied question: who ordered this and why? Is this a minor adjustment quietly handled in the corridors of heaven, or a message slipped past the gate? Modern scholars still split along those two lines. Some keep the focus on ritual, on the book, as a reflection of calendar debates and priestly politics in the last centuries before the Common Era. Others lean into the theology, seeing in these chapters an early attempt to imagine a universe that is both lawful and, in some mysterious way, watched. Both readings have weight. Both may be true at once. For the people who first heard these words, lying under ancient skies far darker than ours, the categories would not have been so separate. To ask how many days the moon borrows light from the sun was, at the same time, to ask what kind of mind thought to lend it, and what kind of order would one day call the lone back in. And so, as the book of the Luminaries closes its long recitation of gates and measures, it leaves you with a strange, almost whispered assurance: the moon is not wandering alone. Its changes are counted, its delays are noticed, its law may be intricate, and occasionally strained, but it is law all the same, nested inside a larger governance that does not sleep, even when you finally do. 3. The Babylonian Enūma. Enlil Lunar Omen Tablets. If Enoch's moon is a civil servant under cosmic law, the Babylonians went one step further. They put that servant under surveillance. Our third warning comes from a vast, dense compilation of clay tablets modern scholars call Enūma Anu Enlil. It is not a story, not a poem, not a philosophical dialogue. It is, in essence, a file cabinet, hundreds upon hundreds of entries, each one following roughly the same pattern. If the moon does this, then that will happen. Where Enoch wrapped the sky in law, the Babylonian scholar-priests wrapped it in conditional clauses. To imagine where these tablets came from, you have to picture a very different kind of night than the one we live under now. No street lights, no glare, just the slow turn of the heavens over flat plains and brick cities, year after year. A horizon low enough that you can see the moon rise, fat and distorted, over the river. Temples with stepped towers, ziggurats, rising like artificial hills in a landscape that is mostly level. On top of those towers and on rooftops, and in temple courtyards, there are observers. They are not astronomers in our modern sense, and not just priests either. They are a hybrid role, the Mesopotamians called Shah Enūma Anu Enlil, scribes of Enūma Anu Enlil. Their job is simple and endless: watch the sky. Write down what you see, send it to the king. Every evening, One of them is on duty as the moon approaches the western horizon, or climbs in the east, or hangs high overhead in some thin pale phase. He notes the date in the local calendar. He marks which watch of the night it is. He pays attention to where exactly the moon appears relative to the constellations they recognize. Then he starts asking the questions that matter. Is the crescent sharp or blurred? Is there a ring around it, a halo? Are there clouds nearby, and if so, of what kind? Does the light of the moon seem red or pale, or like lapis, that deep blue stone the Mesopotamians loved? Is there a strange horn missing from the crescent, a bite taken out at an odd angle? Does the moon rise on time? Does it set early? Does it disappear when, by all expectation, it should still be in the sky? If something looks off, he records it with almost bureaucratic calm. On the 14th day, the moon was surrounded by a halo. The Pleiades stood inside it. Or, night of the 1st, the moon was eclipsed, beginning on its upper left, clearing on its lower right. Then, crucially, he doesn't stop at the description. He ties it to the archive. This is an omen for the king. It concerns his army. Behind those simple phrases stands the weight of decades, even centuries, of notes. Generations of observers looking up, scribbling impressions on wet clay, drying the tablets, filing them in temple libraries. Every war, every flood, every plague, every dynastic crisis entered somewhere in royal records. Later scholars began to line them up, this kind of eclipse, followed by that kind of disaster. A halo like this, followed by a good harvest. A crescent that looks like that, followed by the death of a crown prince. Patterns began to emerge, or at least they felt like patterns. Enūma Anu Enlil is the grand synthesis of that long experiment in watching. It organizes the sky into an enormous set of if-then propositions, but it starts very deliberately with the moon. The moon is the timekeeper, the calendar anchor, the most obviously variable thing in the heavens. It changes shape, it changes brightness. Sometimes it vanishes altogether in a way that feels almost theatrical. For a culture that saw the state and the cosmos as intertwined, that variability is not neutral. It is a language, so the lunar tablets become a kind of dictionary. One section lists what it means if the first crescent is visible on the expected day, or a day late, or a day early. Another cares about which stars share its halo. Another focuses on eclipses, where on the disk the darkening begins, which watch of the night it happens in, how long it lasts. But all of that rests on the daily labour of the observers. We have their routine reports, called astronomical diaries, from later periods in Babylonian history. They read almost monotonously at first glance because that's how careful observation looks. Month X, day Y, moon set, sun rose, distance between them by so and so degrees. Clouds in the west, wind from the north, over and over again. Month after month, year after year, in those diaries you can feel their habits. They measure the interval between moonset and sunrise, watching for when the two luminaries stand opposite each other. They log when the new crescent is first seen after conjunction with the sun. They trace its path against the zodiac, noting which sign the moon is in, and whether it passes unusually close to a bright star or planet. They are not inventing numbers out of nowhere. They are building, slowly, an empirical backbone for an omen system that is anything but casual. Behind each clean if-then on the omen tablets lies the smudged thumbprint of some anonymous scribe, half asleep on a roof, squinting at a faint crescent through dust. There is an almost modern feel to the way they accumulate data. They distinguish between what they saw and what they inferred. If clouds covered the sky, they say so. If an eclipse was predicted but not visible in their city, They still note that the eclipse which was expected did not occur here. The absence becomes its own kind of fact. At the same time, their purpose is not neutral science. It is service. Every observation is made with an eye toward the palace. If the moon is ringed with a halo that encloses Mars, that is not just a pretty atmospheric effect. It is a possible sign that the god of war has been encircled or empowered or threatened. If the full moon takes on a ruddy colour, that is not just scattering of light through dust. It is a potential warning of blood or fire or disease. So the scribe watches, writes, and sends a tablet south along the river by courier to the royal court. There, another specialist reads it aloud and cross-references it with the entries in Enūma anu Enlil. Only then does the omen become a sentence, a forecast of what may be about to break over the throne. For now we are standing with the observers themselves, looking up at a sky that has not yet been interpreted, only described. A dim halo, a strange colour, a creeping shadow at the edge of the moon. The next question, of course, is what these signs were thought to mean, and which of them were feared most. To see which signs were most feared, you have to step away from the rooftop and down into the palace. Because Enūma anu Enlil is not really concerned with the fate of ordinary people. It is obsessed with the king. The sky can threaten an empire, but it does so by threatening the person who sits at its centre. So the most ominous lunar signs are the ones that seem to single him out. At the top of that list sit eclipses, not every eclipse, and not in a vague way. The tablets slice them into categories. If the shadow begins on the western side of the moon, that tends to point toward enemies coming from the west. If it begins on the east, danger is expected from the east. Upper, lower, left, right. Each quadrant is mapped onto parts of the land, parts of the royal family, even parts of the king's body. An eclipse that starts in the upper left and clears in the lower right might be glossed as, the king will face danger, but his enemy will be cut off. Another configuration might say, the crown prince will die. Another, famine will come to the land. The most terrifying entries are blunt. If on the 14th day the moon is eclipsed and its shadow covers its face entirely, the king will die. The full disk swallowed by darkness becomes a symbolic execution. The celestial lamp over the kingdom is snuffed out. Therefore the man at its heart is in mortal peril. But the omen logic goes deeper than simple on-off. They care when the eclipse happens in the night. A shadow that begins in the first watch might touch the outer provinces, the distant borders. One that begins in the middle watch moves closer to the royal city. An eclipse in the last watch, just before dawn, is sometimes read as striking the king himself. They care how long the darkness lasts. A brief, partial bite of shadow is usually bad but survivable. A long, total eclipse is catastrophe. If an eclipse lasts from its beginning until the middle of the watch, the siege of a king will be long. If an eclipse lasts until the end of the watch, overthrow of the dynasty. Duration on the clock of the night translates directly into the duration and intensity of political crisis. The second great cluster of dread omens involves colour. The word blood moon is not Babylonian, but the idea is. When the full moon rose red or turned coppery during an eclipse, that change of hue was rarely treated as neutral. If the moon is red like blood, bloodshed will occur in the land. Sometimes the blood is specified. If the moon is red and its horns are pointed, blood of the king. If the moon is red and dark, and a cloud stands before it, the blood of nobles will flow. Here the sky is not just hinting at violence, it is visualizing it. The reddening of the moon becomes a kind of preview, a stain spread across the heavens before it appears on the ground. Even paler shifts can be ominous. If the moon is dark and its light is weak, the land will be diminished. If the moon is black, like sackcloth, the people of the land will perish. We might think of dust storms, smoke from distant fires, volcanic haze. They thought of divine anger manifested through the dimming of the kingdom's lamp. Halos bring a more intricate sort of anxiety. A ring around the moon by itself can be neutral or even positive, depending on how wide it is and whether the full disk fits neatly inside. But when stars stand within that ring or on its edge, the tablets turn very specific. If a halo surrounds the moon and Jupiter stands within it, the king will have stability. If a halo surrounds the moon and Mars stands within it, the king's army will suffer defeat. Now the moon is no longer just a warning sign. It is a stage hosting the other gods, each one associated with planets or bright stars. A war god inside the halo means war inside the kingdom's defences. A beneficent star inside the ring might indicate protection, prosperity, or safe childbirth for the queen. The most anxious combinations are often the crowded ones. If a halo surrounds the moon and many stars stand within it, the king will be besieged. Many lights trapped inside the circle become enemy armies surrounding a city. The sky itself rehearses the siege. Then there are the absences. If on the day of the expected first crescent the moon is not seen, bad omen for the king. If the moon disappears on an unexpected day, the foundation of the throne will shake. A late or missing crescent is interpreted as a disruption in the calendar and therefore in cosmic order. The king, as guarantor of that order, is implicated. What looks to us like an inconvenient cloud bank could be documented as a metaphysical fault line opening under the palace. Even small irregularities in the crescent shape are given teeth. If the right horn of the moon is short, the king of Akkad will be seized. If the left horn of the moon is broken, the enemy king will fall. The two horns become stand-ins for rival rulers. A damaged horn promises misfortune to whichever side is mapped onto that side of the disk. The scribe is not just reading light and shadow, he is reading a jewel. Through all of this, one pattern keeps appearing. The most ominous lunar signs are the ones that suggest reversal, of life into death, of brightness into dimness, of wholeness into brokenness. Total eclipses, blood-coloured faces, missing crescents, shattered horns, halos turned into sieges. They are moments when the moon stops behaving like the reliable clock it usually is, and instead behaves like a living thing under attack. For a king whose authority depends on the regular turning of days and months, that is the deepest threat of all. It is not surprising, then, that entire sections of Enūma Anu Enlil are devoted to one question that follows naturally from all this fear. If the sky has already pronounced a sentence, is there any way to change the verdict? The Babylonians thought there was. If a lunar eclipse promised death for the king, the answer was not to shrug and accept it. The answer was to outmaneuver the omen. One of the strangest institutions in Mesopotamian court life grew directly out of this pressure, the substitute king ritual. If the tablets read properly indicated that the king will die, the solution was, in effect, to redirect the blow. A low-ranking noble, or in some accounts even a condemned man, could be elevated to the status of king for a set period. He would wear the crown, sit on the throne, eat the royal food. The real ruler would step back into ritual obscurity, sometimes described as the farmer. The logic is brutal and almost lawyerly. The gods have decreed the king must die. Very well. For these weeks, this man is the king. Let the sentence fall on him. At the end of the ritual period, usually marked out by the same calendar that tracked the moon, the substitute would be quietly executed. The true king would wash, change garments, reclaim his name and title, and the omen would be treated as discharged. It is a chilling window into how seriously those lunar warning lines were taken. They were not metaphors, they were obligations to be met, threats to be managed, clauses in a cosmic contract. Behind the drama of substitute kings, there is something else emerging, a worldview in which the sky, though divine, follows rules. If an eclipse in a certain watch on a certain day means a siege, and if a specific ritual or political maneuver can redirect that siege away from the capital, then both the danger and the remedy are, in some sense, predictable, consistent. That is where Enūma Anu Enlil quietly stops being just a book of omens and starts looking like the skeleton of an observational science. To compile thousands of omens about the moon, you have to pay attention. You have to know when the crescent should appear, which nights should be dark, how big the horns ought to be in each part of the month. You have to notice when a halo forms, how often the disk looks red, how long an eclipse really lasts. And you have to do this not once, but for generations. The scribes who copied and expanded these tablets were not making wild guesses every time a cloud passed across the sky. They were inheriting and refining a tradition that had been watching, measuring and correlating for centuries. If a certain configuration of eclipse has, in the record, preceded a famine more than once, it is promoted into the canon. If a configuration seems harmless in experience, it might be downgraded or ignored. We glimpse this process in the way some omens are glossed with remarks like, "This has occurred before and the land was at peace," or "This is not an evil omen for Akkad." Those tiny comments are, in effect, data notes. By the first millennium BCE, Babylonian scholars had pushed this impulse much further. They were calculating when eclipses would happen in advance, using repeating cycles. They were tracking the moon's irregular speed against the background stars, predicting when it would appear late, when it would swing higher or lower in the sky. They developed what historians now call goal year texts, where positions of the moon and planets in a past year were used to forecast the same phenomena in a future one. All of that work stands downstream from the omen lists. The constant need to know whether tonight's crescent, tonight's halo, tonight's shadow was normal or dangerous, forced them to define normal in the first place. And once you know what normal looks like, you can see patterns, cycles, deviations. You can begin to ask not just what does this mean, but when will this happen again? That shift in thinking is subtle, but it is enormous. The night sky in this worldview is still full of gods, but it is not random. It is legible. If you learn its grammar, you can read the future of kings. If you learn it well enough, you can even negotiate with that future. It is easy from a modern distance to smile at the idea that a missing crescent in the West could endanger a dynasty. But the habits required to sustain that belief, careful record-keeping, strict attention to timing, willingness to test interpretation against outcome, are very close to the habits that underpin astronomy itself. You can see it in the way the tablets are structured. Each entry ties a precise configuration of lunar behavior to a specific earthly event. If on the 15th day the moon is dark and its disk is weak in the first watch, then something will happen. That is a conditional statement. If X, then Y. Repeat it thousands of times with different X and Y, and you are not far from a data set. The fact that those Ys are about kings dying and crops failing does not erase the structure. It only tells you what kind of outcomes they were most afraid to miss. And in the spaces between fear and method, another kind of curiosity starts to flicker. If the moon can warn us about war, what else might it reveal? If Jupiter inside a halo bodes well for the throne, does Jupiter's motion along the ecliptic follow rules too? If a blood-coloured disk suggests violence, could its rare appearance be plotted, its cause inferred? Those questions are not written on the clay, but the tools to ask them are. Somewhere around here is a good place to mention something for you listening to all this in the dark. If you like tracing these old half-scientific, half-mystical threads, there's a book about 12 unexplained historical mysteries you can get through our website. The link is in the description, waiting for you when you're awake enough to tap it. For now, let the main point settle. The Enūma Anu Enlil tablets show us a civilization that could not afford to treat the moon as background decoration. For them, its phases and glitches were reports from the divine bureaucracy, performance reviews for kings, early warning systems for empire. In watching the moon this intensely, they ended up discovering something unintended, that the heavens repeat themselves, that eclipses come in families, that halos return under certain winds and seasons, that a late crescent is not a random insult, but part of a pattern you might someday be able to chart. Their world remained full of gods and omens, but inside that world, step by step, a new idea was taking shape. The night sky is not only a message, it is a system, and as we move on to other cultures and other lunar warnings, that quiet discovery will follow us. Because once you start to suspect that the moon has rules, it becomes very hard to ever look at it the same way again. For the Chinese moon-eating dragon eclipse tradition, by the time we reach ancient China, the idea that the moon follows rules hasn't gone away. It has just been wrapped in a different language. Instead of clay tablets in Akkadian, you have bronze inscriptions and bamboo strips. Instead of omens framed as legal clauses from the gods of Akkad, you have court chronicles addressed, in effect, to heaven itself. But the same pressure is there. Kings who cannot afford surprises in the sky. The earliest Chinese eclipse records don't read like myths at all. They read like paperwork in the Shang dynasty. More than 3,000 years ago, diviners heated animal shoulder blades and turtle plastrons over fire until they cracked. Then they carved questions and answers into the bone. Many of those questions are about crops, war, childbirth and rain. Some, though, are about the moon. On the next Xin day, there will be an eating of the moon. The phrase is simple and strange. Not the moon will disappear. Not an eclipse will occur. An eating. The cracks would be red, the answer inscribed, auspicious, inauspicious, or unclear. If the prediction turned out right, that too might be recorded. Over time, those fragments accumulate into something like a weather log for the heavens. By the early Zhou period, around the first millennium BCE, these scattered notes harden into formal history. Court scribes start keeping annals year by year, noting battles, droughts, abdications, and, tucked into the margins, episodes when the moon goes wrong. One famous entry from the spring and autumn annals, a chronicle of the state of Lu, reads in stark, almost flat language. In the 7th month, on the day Gengshu, there was an eating of the moon. No explanation. No story about why it happened. Just a date, a sign, and the quiet assumption that anyone reading will understand that this was not nothing. Later commentators could not leave it so bare. Centuries after the event, scholars pore over these entries, linking them to other records, checking whether the eclipse coincided with rebellions, famines, or royal mistakes. Sometimes they find correlations, sometimes they do not. But the habit is the same as in Babylon. Treat the darkening of the moon as a data point in the life of the state. The political stakes were clear from the beginning. Early Chinese kings ruled under what later philosophers called the mandate of heaven. The idea in its mature form is simple and ruthless. Heaven grants the right to rule, but the mandate is conditional. A ruler who governs badly, who taxes cruelly, who neglects rituals or lets the people suffer, can lose it. How do you know when heaven is displeased? You watch the sky. If the sun is blotted out at noon, if comets appear out of season, if the moon, that steady monthly metronome of time and tide, is suddenly devoured in the night, something is off in the relationship between above and below. In that worldview, an eclipse is not just an astronomical event. It is feedback. It is no accident that some of the earliest dated eclipses in Chinese records are tightly bound to stories about officials whose job it was to see them coming. One of the oldest tales preserved in the Book of Documents and embroidered by later tradition tells of two court astronomers in the Shang or early Zhou period named Si and Ho. Depending on the version, they are drunk, lazy, or simply neglectful. When an eclipse occurs and they have failed to predict it, the court is caught unprepared. Rituals are not in place, drums are not beaten at the right moment. Chaos, or at least embarrassment, follows. For this failure, the story says, they are executed. Modern historians debate how much of this episode is literal, and how much is moral fable. But the fact that it is told at all is revealing. An eclipse is important enough that missing it could cost lives. The king expects forewarning. The state invests in specialists who do nothing but look up. From a modern perspective, we might see those early astronomers as proto-scientists trying to extract a cycle from a messy sky. From within their own culture, they are more than technicians. They are guardians of the hinge between heaven and earth. If they can tell the king, on this day, in this month, the moon will be eaten, and if the appropriate steps are taken, then the disturbance can be folded back into order. It becomes an event with a place on the calendar, not a random assault out of the dark. That is why the earliest records of eclipses cluster, not in folk tales, but in court documents. The Zuo commentary, which elaborates on the spring and autumn annals, goes out of its way to link unusual phenomena in the sky with speeches about virtue and government. When the moon is swallowed, senior ministers use the opportunity to lecture the ruler. This is a warning. Do not ignore it. They quote older sayings. Heaven shows portents. It does not speak. The sage examines the portents and amends his conduct. Notice the implication. The moon's behaviour is a kind of mute language. It does not form words. It does not argue, but its sudden dimming, its bloody tint, its vanishing at the wrong time of month, these are comments on policy. The dragon, in this early phase, is more hinted at than described. Bronze vessels talk about the eating, divination bones about harm, the annals about aberration. Only later will the image coalesce into something vivid, a great creature in the sky clamping its jaws around the lunar disk. Before the monster has a name, though the consequences are already political. An unexpected eclipse can be used by rivals to argue that the king has lost favour. A well-predicted one can be spun as proof that the ruler's astronomers are in tune with heaven's cycles, that nothing catches the dynasty off guard. Over centuries, this pressure to be ready leaves traces in the records. Astronomical treatises from the Han dynasty preserve methods for calculating when eclipses are likely. Officials debate which theoretical scheme matches heaven's behaviour best. Some propose that the sun and moon are like lamps sometimes obscured. Others argue that they are bodies moving in circles at different heights, occasionally overlapping. None of these models is quite right, but all of them share a premise. Eclipses are not arbitrary. They can be anticipated, timed, perhaps even partially tamed by knowledge and ritual. And once you think that way, you need more than quiet notes in an annal. You need a public response that shows the people and heaven that you noticed, that you care, that you are doing your part while the dragon takes its bite. That response, loud and frantic and strangely choreographed, is where we turn next. If you imagine that the moon is being eaten, the next question is simple and urgent. Do you just watch, or do you try to make the eater choke? Across much of the ancient world, people chose the second option. In China, this decision hardened into something remarkably consistent. A set of ritual responses that could be triggered the moment the lunar disk began to dim. The earliest accounts are almost terse. Later narratives, especially from the Han onward, fill in the texture. When an eclipse was anticipated, or even just suspected, the palace did not stay dark and silent. The response was almost the opposite of the normal decorum of the court. Normally sound at court was controlled, ranked, and measured. Bells and drums belonged to ritual. They were tuned to specific pitches associated with particular seasons, directions, and virtues. Music was, in theory, a direct expression of cosmic order. An eclipse shattered that musical calm. As the shadow crept over the moon, gongs and drums were beaten, not in graceful patterns, but in something closer to a clamour. There are descriptions of people striking pots and pans, of soldiers and commoners alike raising a roar. Officials who on most nights would have been faulted for such disorder were expected to join in. The logic was simple enough. If a dragon or some hostile force was devouring the moon, noise might frighten it away. Later commentators, who liked to moralize everything, sometimes tried to tidy this up. They explained that the noise was not literally about scaring a reptile in the sky. It was a way of assisting the moon, of aiding the yin force against improper encroachment. But buried in those polished phrases is the memory of something more visceral. A moment when the boundary between heaven and earth felt thin, and the proper response was to throw decorum aside and shout into the dark. This was not a purely popular reaction, it was organised. In some dynasties, regulations spell out who should do what when an eclipse begins. Court musicians were to assemble, specific drums, sometimes kept for this purpose, were to be brought out. The Bureau of Astronomy, or whatever name it carried in that era, would have already warned the throne of the likely hour. When the appointed time came, the emperor, or in later times his stand-ins, performed prescribed acts. The ruler might withdraw from the main hall, stepping away from the central throne. In some accounts he takes off the imperial cap, or loosens the girdle, or symbolically humbles himself, facing north instead of south. Ministers kneel. Some prostrate themselves and knock their heads on the floor, a gesture of submission not just to the emperor, but to the unseen heaven above him. Prayers are recited, or chanted silently from memory. Inscriptions talk about self-reproach and inquiry into faults. While the drums thunder outside, the language inside the hall is all about repentance, reform, and the hope that the anomaly will pass. The combination is striking. Outside, banging, shouting, the old magical impulse to fight noise with noise. Inside, a ruler and his bureaucrats engaged in a staged confession, acknowledging that if the moon is being harmed, the fault might lie somewhere in their own conduct. Neither side claims that these acts literally push the shadow off the lunar surface. Yet both are considered necessary. To do nothing would be unthinkable. It would be to leave the attack unchallenged, to ignore a message you have spent centuries training yourself to read. Over time, these practices coalesce into formal rubrics. By the Han dynasty, manuals outline the suburban sacrifices, the great offerings at the borders of the capital, and alongside them you find instructions for responding to eclipses. Officials must draft memorials acknowledging heaven's portent. Smaller sacrifices might be ordered to local deities. Punishments or reforms are sometimes announced in the wake of an eclipse, as if to show that the warning has had an effect. The dragon image grows sharper as the centuries go on. Texts speak explicitly of fighting the dragon, of driving it away. Children are told stories in which villagers save the moon by making such a racket that the monster, startled or irritated, lets go of its prey. Yet if you read the actual regulations, what stands out is not wild improvisation, but choreography. There is a timetable. At the first sign of the eating, strike the drums. If the eating passes a certain fraction, issue such and such proclamation. When the light returns, cease the noise, offer thanks. The state takes something primal, a fear that the sky is being damaged, and folds it into procedure. Eclipses become occasions for drill. Even the commoner's participation is, in some periods, semi-official. Local magistrates are expected to lead, giving the signal to start the din. In some regions, records hint at fines or rebukes for those who continue to drink or gamble through an eclipse, as if nothing were happening. Failing to join the noise can be read by zealous moralists as failing to care about the health of the realm. Modern readers might see in this a kind of social technology. The eclipse provides a rare moment when everyone, from the throne down to the poorest household, is focused on the same thing. Sound becomes a way to join that focus, to prove that you are aligned with the centre. It is in passages about these rituals that later storytellers slip in another layer. While court scribes catalogue drummings and bowings, popular collections talk about people firing arrows into the sky, or lighting torches, or burning paper charms to light the way for the moon. Some of those details are probably embroidery. Others may preserve local customs that never made it into formal codes. Either way, they show the same pattern, an instinctive refusal to be passive in the face of a darkened moon. Centuries later, when astronomers are calmly calculating eclipse paths with trigonometry and armillary spheres, this noisy heritage is still in the background. Officials might no longer insist that beating pots drives off a literal beast, but the ceremonial script remains. Drums are struck, proclamations are drafted, the event is acknowledged, and threaded through some of those later discussions, often in a single line or a brief aside, is a quieter, stranger thought: if the eclipse can be predicted, if the dragon's appetite follows a pattern, what exactly is this creature in the sky? Questions like that, hovering at the edges of the ritual, begin to tug the dragon away from pure myth and towards something else. We will follow that tug next, as the moon-eating dragon starts to share the sky with early Chinese theories of shadows, spheres, and hidden alignments you were never meant to see. And somewhere in that tangle of monster and mechanism, the moon itself begins to look less like a lantern and more like a place. By the time thinkers start asking what kind of creature obeys tables and timetables, the dragon has already done its work. It has trained people to see an eclipse not as a private curiosity, but as a public message. That message in early Chinese thought is almost never random. Heaven, as the philosophers like to say, does not speak with words. It speaks with patterns, and when those patterns falter, you're supposed to ask why. This is where the moon-eating dragon stops being just an animal and starts to look like a moral instrument. In the classical histories, eclipses rarely appear alone. They walk onto the page arm in arm with corruption cases, strange weather, rebellions or questionable policy decisions. A minister misleads the ruler. A cruel tax is imposed. A war is launched without just cause. And somewhere in the same year, sometimes in the same month, the moon goes dark. Later editors are very comfortable drawing the line between those dots. They write that yin overcomes yang, or that luminosity is diminished because virtue is obscured. In the language of the time, that isn't just poetry. It is diagnosis. The sky is the body, the dynasty is the mind. An eclipse is like a fever spike. Seen that way, the dragon is eating more than light. It is eating reputation. If the moon is the polished mirror that reflects the ruler's virtue, then a bite taken out of that mirror suggests a flaw. Archaic inscriptions spell it out in plain terms. The moon was eaten. The king feared his own faults. Sometimes the Chronicles almost sound like a physician's notes. First the symptom, a partial eclipse observed in such and such direction. Then the interpretation, heaven displays resentment. Finally the prescription, remonstrate with the ruler, lighten punishments, delay executions, suspend music and entertainment until further notice. In this world, you don't get to shrug and say, well, that's just orbital mechanics. To ignore the portent is to pretend that your actions don't ripple into the larger order of things. That logic cuts both ways. For a conscientious ruler, the eclipse can be an opportunity. It provides cover to do things that might otherwise be unpopular. You can cancel a burdensome levy, dismiss a corrupt favourite, or call for investigations into local abuses, and then point to the sky as your excuse. You're not attacking entrenched interests because you feel like it. You are answering heaven. For a nervous ruler, the same eclipse can be terrifying. It suggests that the universe keeps records, that whatever you thought you hid behind palace walls has somehow been tallied and projected back at you in the open sky. Advisors exploit this fear. Some are genuinely moralists, using eclipses to argue for reform. Others are skilled in the politics of Omen. They can take a dimming moon and turn it into leverage. The pattern becomes familiar. The moon darkens. Petitions pour in, "We beg your majesty to examine yourself." In a few cases, emperors respond with self-written confessions, blaming themselves for droughts, floods, and celestial anomalies, and promising to do better. Taken literally, it sounds almost superstitious. Taken structurally, it's something else. It is a system that links power to accountability through the medium of the sky. Because the portents don't stop with one person. In the philosophical texts, there is a constant worry about resonance, the idea that disorder at one level of the cosmos vibrates through all the others. A cruel official in a distant province, a breakdown in family hierarchies, a loss of ritual respect between younger and older brothers, any of that can, in theory, contribute to cosmic imbalance. So the eclipse is read in widening circles, first as a whisper to the throne, then as a nudge to the bureaucracy, and finally as a lesson to everyone. If the moon can be bitten, so can your life. Behave improperly, and the same shadow that eats the lunar disk might, metaphorically, eat your good fortune, your descendants, your standing. Let resentments build up like unacknowledged clouds, and sooner or later the light over your household will dim. Stories carry this lesson where edicts can't. In village tales, the dragon isn't always driven away by drums alone. Sometimes it is tricked by a farmer who shares food with a stranger, or frightened off when a miser finally gives away grain during a famine. In those versions, what restores the moon is not noise, but an act of unexpected virtue. The surface plot is simple: a monster, a crisis, a resolution. Underneath, the pattern is familiar. When things go dark, the way back to light runs through moral conduct. Even the later, more rational astronomers sometimes keep a hint of this. They can compute when and where an eclipse will happen, but they still frame it in memoranda as a warning, a summons to caution, a reason for the ruler to rectify what is within. The dragon, by then, may be half metaphor, half memory. Yet its teeth are still useful. They give symbolic bite to admonitions that might otherwise be ignored. Somewhere in this blend of beast and ethics, the moon itself takes on a new role. It is no longer just a cold lamp following a predictable path. It becomes a kind of celestial conscience, reliable in its motions, but dangerous when obscured. Every time it is eaten, the question returns, what exactly has gone wrong? Different ages give different answers. A harsh legalist might say, the people are lazy. A Confucian moralist might say the ruler has failed to cultivate his inner virtue. A Taoist recluse might shrug and say the world is out of balance because everyone is trying too hard. But they all agree on one thing: you're supposed to take it personally. If the heavens can bend enough to let a shadow cross the moon, then perhaps your own habits, your own assumptions about how fixed everything is, could also be shaken loose. That uneasy thought will follow us as we move on, because the Chinese were not the only ones who treated a troubled moon as a mirror. Elsewhere, philosophers and priests were staring up at that same darkened disk, asking different questions, and sometimes drawing even stranger conclusions about what kind of universe would allow its brightest ornaments to bleed and vanish. And if you ever find yourself wanting to wander further into puzzles like this, there's a book about a dozen of the most stubborn historical mysteries waiting on our website. The link is resting quietly in the description. For now, let the image linger. A dragon's jaws on the moon, a world holding its breath, and a silence under all the noise where people wonder, not just will the light return, but what is it asking of us this time? 5. Aristotle's shadow argument and the perfect heavens problem shift the scene now from drums and dragons to marble colonnades and cool, starlit courtyards. The same moon that once shivered in the jaws of a Chinese sky beast is now hanging over the Aegean, bright and steady above the tiled roofs of Greek city-states. No imperial proclamations here, just small clusters of people on flat rooftops or hilltops, cloaks wrapped tight against the night air, arguing. The Greeks argue about everything, what a soul is, what justice is, what a number is. So of course they argue about what the world itself looks like. Not just the map of it, but the shape. To you, growing up with globes in classrooms and photos of Earth from orbit, the question might feel almost childish. But if all you ever see is a flat horizon and the sea dropping away in a straight line, round Earth isn't obvious. It is a conclusion you have to earn. For centuries, different Greek thinkers toy with different models. Some say the Earth is a flat disk, like a shield laid on the waters. Others imagine it as a short drum or a shallow bowl. A few even suggest it stretches on without end. What they all share is a basic problem. If you can't step outside the world and look back at it, how do you know what shape it really is? Their best tool is the same one that stirred fear and ritual in China, the eclipse. When the moon passes into Earth's shadow, something very strange happens for anyone willing to look up and keep looking. The night doesn't just darken. A bite appears on the moon, then deepens, then swallows it almost whole. But the edge of that bite isn't jagged or random. It is smooth, clean, curved. And for careful observers, that curve is the first clue. Greek thinkers before Aristotle had already noticed this. Some, like Anaxagoras and others, whose works survive only in fragments and quotations, treat eclipses as rare chances to let the Earth reveal itself, not through geography, but through geometry. You cannot see the Earth from the outside, but you can see the outline of its shadow. And that outline, every time a lunar eclipse rolls around, is part of a circle. Aristotle, writing in the 4th century BCE, becomes the one who fixes this argument into a textbook example. In his work on the heavens, he lines up pieces of evidence, one after another, as if building a quiet legal case for a spherical Earth. Ships disappearing hull first over the horizon. New constellations becoming visible as you travel south. And right in the middle, the behaviour of the Earth's shadow on the moon. If you had a flat disk and you shone a light on it from many different angles, the shape of the shadow it casts would change. Sometimes more like a line, sometimes more like an oval, sometimes skewed. A plate held at different tilts draws different shadows. But the Earth, through eclipse after eclipse, tells a different story. No matter when the eclipse happens, no matter where in the sky the moon is, the outline cutting into its light is rounded. Not a straight edge, not the profile of a square or a triangle, but a consistent curved bite, always singing the same simple shape. Aristotle takes this very seriously. He points out that only one solid object can cast a consistently circular shadow from many angles, a sphere. From that he infers that the Earth cannot be flat. It must be rounded like a ball, To him, this is not just clever reasoning. It is a moment when the cosmos allows a human being, standing on a small patch of land, to deduce something about the whole planet just by watching a ghostly curve drift across the moon. In a way, it's an ancient version of remote sensing. The moon becomes a screen on which the Earth projects a silent message about its shape. Every eclipse is a repeat broadcast of the same diagram. Here is the curve of your world. Other Greek thinkers refine the idea. Some, like the mathematician Eratosthenes a century later, go further and try to measure the size of this spherical Earth using shadows cast by the sun at different latitudes. But the conceptual leap is already in place. You live on a round world, proven not by global travel, but by careful attention to a darkening moon. All of this fits nicely with a growing Greek taste for order and pattern in the sky. If the Earth is a sphere, perhaps the moon is too. Perhaps the sun, perhaps all the wandering stars that drift slowly against the fixed constellations. This is the seed of a new cosmic architecture, nested spheres, orderly, comprehensible, almost musical in their regularity. And for Aristotle, that elegance is more than just aesthetic preference. It becomes an axiom about how the universe must be arranged. He watches the same eclipses that frighten Chinese rulers into moral reforms, and he extracts from them something very different, a sense that the heavens are fundamentally rational, that their motions are subject to reason, not caprice. But that confidence will lead him into a puzzle he never fully escapes. Because when you insist that the sky is made of perfect, unchanging spheres, and you keep staring at the moon's injured, shadowed face, another question starts to surface. If the heavens are flawless, why does their most familiar lamp sometimes vanish, bruise, or bleed? Hold that tension for a moment. We have seen what eclipses could prove about the shape of the Earth. Next, we step deeper into Aristotle's universe and watch what happens when his ideal of perfect crystalline heavens runs straight into the stubborn, speckled reality of the moon. For Aristotle, that tension is not a minor annoyance. It is a crack that runs right through the heart of his system, because for him the universe is divided by a very sharp line. Below the moon, in the realm of earth, air, fire and water, everything is corruptible. Things grow, rot, break and burn. Stones fall, bodies age. Storms rip through crops and then fade. This is the region of change, of becoming and passing away. Above the moon, in the realm of the stars and the planets, everything is supposed to be different. There, Aristotle says, a special substance dominates, a fifth element, sometimes called aether. Unlike the heavy, quarrelsome elements of Earth, aether has one simple behaviour. It moves in perfect circles, forever. No starting, no stopping, no decay, just endless uniform rotation. From that idea, he builds a sky made of nested crystalline spheres, each one carrying a light. The fixed stars on the outermost shell, then, moving inward, the spheres of Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, the Sun, Venus, Mercury and the Moon, each sphere turning with mathematical grace. In such a universe, the word perfect is not just a compliment. It is a technical description. Perfect things, in Aristotle's sense, are complete, unchanging, fulfilling their nature without flaw. A circle is perfect because it has no beginning or end. A sphere is perfect because all its points are equally distant from its centre. The heavens, made of aether and moving in circles, must be perfect in this same way, smooth, uniform, immune to the bruises and scars that mark the world below. That's the theory. Then you look at the actual moon. Even to the naked eye, on a clear night, it does not look like a polished pearl. It is mottled. Some regions are bright, others dusky. A casual observer can see dark patches shaped like seas, long pale streaks, faint rings. The surface is not a flawless white sphere, but something blotched and complicated. During an eclipse, this becomes harder to ignore. As the Earth's curved shadow crawls over the lunar face, the contrast deepens. The lighter highlands stand out against the darker basins. The reddening of the eclipsed disk, when the moon dips fully into Earth's shadow and glows with that strange blood-rust light, makes every irregularity more vivid. If you are committed to a heaven of perfect spheres, this is uncomfortable. Some Greek thinkers after Aristotle will happily say, centuries later, that the moon is a world with mountains and valleys, just like Earth, that those dark regions are deep plains, that the bright zones are elevated. But Aristotle himself resists this picture. He cannot easily accept that the heavenly body nearest to us might be chipped, pitted, or stained. Instead, he tries to make the imperfections slide off the moon and land somewhere else. Perhaps, he suggests, the blemishes are not on the lunar sphere itself, but in the medium between us and it. Maybe what you are seeing are disturbances in the air, vapours, smoke, clouds that just happen to lie along the line of sight. The moon behind that veil could remain perfectly uniform. This is a clever move, but it creates as many questions as it resolves. If the marks are just atmospheric, why do they keep the same pattern night after night, year after year? Why does the same face of the moon seem to look back at you with the same dark eyes and pale forehead? Why do ancient cultures across different regions, breathing different air, describe similar shapes when they talk about the man in the moon, or the rabbit, or the woman? The stubborn consistency of those features makes it hard to blame them on passing clouds. Then there is the way sunlight and shadow behave along the moon's edge outside of eclipses. As the crescent waxes and wanes, the boundary between day and night on the lunar surface, the terminator does not look like the clean line on a polished ball. It is ragged, with small bulges of light and tiny bays of darkness. If you stare long enough, you can convince yourself that something three-dimensional is happening there, as if light is catching on heights and sinking into hollows. Later observers with telescopes will interpret this as evidence of craters and mountains. For Aristotle, without magnification, it is simply another irritation. The heavens are supposed to be pure. The moon keeps behaving as if it is not. And then there is the drama of colour during a total lunar eclipse. If a perfect crystalline body passes into a perfect clean shadow, you might expect it to wink out, or at least turn a uniform grey. Instead, the moon softens into copper, rust, or wine-dark red. Sometimes it becomes almost invisible. At other times it glows like a banked coal. The hue depends on Earth's atmosphere filtering sunlight around the edges of our planet and bending it into the umbra. Ancient observers do not know the optics, of course, but they see the symptom, a heavenly lamp that can be bruised, stained, seemingly wounded. Aristotle cannot say that the moon suffers injury, that would drag heavenly objects down into the muddy theatre of change and decay. So he strains to keep the wound on our side of the divide. If the moon looks blood-red, perhaps that is because the intervening air is thick with smoke, dust or mist. In that case, it is not the lunar sphere that changes, but the lens through which we view it. Once again, the explanation lets the sky remain perfect, at the cost of making the region just above our heads more complicated and murky. Over and over this pattern repeats. Whenever observation hints that the moon might share something with Earth, blemishes, irregularities, a history written on its face, Aristotle gently pushes the evidence away from the heavens and down into the sublunary realm. It is as if he is trying to keep a philosophical promise he made at the beginning of his system, that there really is a hard border between the corruptible and the incorruptible, between the changing world and the perfectly circular motions of the spheres. Some of his readers then and later find this comforting. a faultless heaven above, reliable and regular, while all the mess of life stays below. Others feel the discomfort. If the universe is so tidy, why does it require so many excuses? These questions echo quietly through the centuries, even as Aristotle's model becomes the standard classroom cosmos from the Hellenistic world to the medieval universities. Scholars copy his texts, comment on them, defend them, and build elaborate diagrams of crystalline shells turning in their appointed ways. They repeat his claims that the heavens are made of a different stuff, immune to the wear and tear that gnaws at everything on earth. And yet, any time someone steps out on a clear night and lets their eyes adjust, the same moon rises with the same shadows and stains, the same uneasy evidence that the upper world might not be as pristine as the books say. Some later thinkers will try to repair the theory by introducing new layers of spheres, new mechanisms, new compromises, hoping to keep the perfection of the heavens while accounting for awkward details. Others will begin to suspect that the entire distinction between a flawless sky and a flawed earth might be built on sand. Before we get to them, and to the first bold suggestions that the moon is a scarred physical place, not a perfect lamp, there is one more piece of context to add, because this uneasy dance between theory and observation does not just happen in lonely observatories or among philosophers pacing colonnades. It seeps into stories, sermons, and omens. It shapes how people feel when the moon goes dark or turns red or shows its face through thin cloud. And if you're curious about how many other ancient puzzles have left similar fingerprints on history, there is a book of 12 unexplained mysteries you can find on the website, linked in the description, waiting there if your waking mind wants more, once your dreaming mind has finished with this. For now, stay with Aristotle's problem. You have a cosmos that demands perfect spheres, and a familiar watchful moon that keeps insisting, quietly, stubbornly, that it is anything but. In the next watch of the night, new eyes will turn upward, and the first cracks in that crystalline sky will begin to widen. Those new eyes belong at first to people who still speak Aristotle's language. In the centuries after him, Greek and Hellenistic astronomers inherit his basic picture: Earth at the centre, crystalline spheres beyond, circular motions, aether in the heights. They admire his logic, respect his authority, and often begin their own works by praising him. But they also inherit the same sky. People like Hipparchus and Ptolemy take meticulous measurements of the moon's path, the timing of eclipses, the way its apparent size shifts. They are not just stargazers, they are calculators, compiling tables, plotting motions, testing predictions. To make their numbers match what they actually see, they discover that simple, perfect circles are not enough. The moon does not move at a perfectly uniform speed. Its apparent diameter subtly changes. Its path wanders a little north and south of the ecliptic. Eclipses happen on a schedule that is regular, but not as simple as a basic model would prefer. So they begin to add adjustments, smaller circles riding on larger ones, off-center points of rotation, geometrical tricks that let a near-circular motion imitate the oddities of observation. These are the famous epicycles and deferents of Greek astronomy. On paper, the motions stay circular, so the ideal of heavenly perfection can be said to survive. In practice, the sky is becoming a patchwork of corrections. Every new irregularity that observation reveals calls for another small wheel, another carefully tuned parameter, another quiet admission that the heavens are not behaving as straightforwardly as philosophy once promised. Even so, for many centuries, there is a kind of truce. The moon's blemishes can be blamed on the air. Its motions, however convoluted, can be described with circles upon circles. The crystalline spheres may be creaking under the weight of all the extra machinery, but they are still standing. Then, long after the ancient schools have faded, a new set of instruments enters the story. By the late medieval and early modern periods, Lenses have been ground clear and smooth enough to magnify the night. What the naked eye once guessed at, glass now shoves into sharp relief. When Galileo turns his telescope toward the moon in the early 17th century, he sees something Aristotle tried very hard to deny: shadows that behave like the shadows of mountains, sunlit peaks standing on the night side of the Terminator, black pits with bright rims catching the dawn, chains of craters marching across the surface. The lunar face is no longer a vague pattern you can dismiss as vapours or tricks of perception. It is a landscape. Galileo sketches what he sees, and in his little book on the starry messenger, writes in a way that is quietly devastating for the old model. He compares lunar features to terrestrial ones. He estimates the heights of the mountains from the lengths of their shadows. He speaks of valleys, plains, and rugged ridges, not of ethereal, seamless spheres. For those raised on Aristotle's distinction between perfect aether above and corruptible matter below, this is not just an astronomical update. It is a philosophical insult. If the moon has mountains, then it has highs and lows, erosion and impact, history and scars. It belongs, in some sense, to the same family as Earth. The bright line between the celestial and the sublunary begins to blur. Other observers, using their own telescopes, confirm and refine the picture. They map Moralia and highlands, name craters after scholars and saints. They watch new phenomena, the way light creeps into deep basins, how certain regions glow differently. The more closely they look, the less the moon resembles a flawless lamp, and the more it looks like a battered stone. At the same time, the larger architecture of the heavens is being rearranged. Copernicus moves the sun to the centre in his calculations, keeping circles for a while but loosening Earth's grip on cosmic privilege. Tycho Brahe, with his precise pre-telescope instruments, observes a bright new star in 1572, a supernova blooming in what was supposed to be the changeless realm of the fixed stars. In 1577, he tracks a comet that slices through the supposed planetary spheres instead of bouncing off them like a thrown stone through glass. If there are rigid crystalline shells out there, they are strangely transparent to exploding stars and wandering comets. Each of these events chips away at the old confidence. The heavens, once imagined as a polished clock made of different, nobler stuff, start to look more like an extension of the same physical reality we experience on Earth, full of bodies that can appear and vanish, collide and break, bear marks of ancient violence. In that emerging picture, the moon becomes a kind of bridge. It is still near enough to feel familiar, to show phases and eclipses the way it always has. But now, under magnification, it also reveals that the universe beyond us is not exempt from roughness, from accident, from time. Later theories will go further, suggesting the moon was born from a colossal impact, that its maria are solidified seas of lava, that its craters record billions of years of bombardment. In that story, the lunar surface is not an embarrassment to be explained away, it is a document. Aristotle's shadow argument for Earth's roundness survives, but the philosophical frame around it does not. The curved edge of the eclipse still traces the shape of our planet. The same event he once used to elevate a perfect heaven now anchors us in a universe where the same physical laws seem to hold from the ground beneath our feet to the crater rims of the moon and beyond. And so when you watch the Earth's shadow slide across that face, turning it copper, then letting it brighten again, you're not just seeing a tidy play of geometry. You are looking at the quiet undoing of an ancient promise that somewhere above the mess of life there is a realm untouched by flaw. The old crystalline spheres have fallen away. The moon remains, scarred and steady, a reminder that the sky is not a separate, spotless kingdom, but part of the same unfolding story we inhabit here below. In the next tale of the night, other cultures will read that story differently, turning the same dimming disk into dragons, omens, and warnings. But the unease that began with Aristotle's perfect heavens will still be there, lingering in the background, every time the light goes strange. 6. Mesoamerican Eclipse Portents in the Dresden Codex. We leave Aristotle's ruined crystal spheres and Galileo's cratered moon behind, and step into a very different night. Not a Mediterranean harbour or a Tuscan hillside now, but a humid darkness over the lowlands of what is now southern Mexico and Guatemala. The air is heavy, alive with insects and distant thunder. Somewhere in a stone city, torches burn low. Priests and scribes climb narrow stairways toward the tops of pyramids, not with telescopes, but with bark paper books. One of those books, against all odds, survives. Today we call it the Dresden Codex, because it ended up in a German library, far from the forests and plazas where it was created. It is one of the very few pre-Columbian Maya manuscripts that escaped the bonfires of conquest and conversion. Most of its siblings were destroyed. This one slipped through history's fingers. It is small by the standards of modern books, but it does not behave like a modern book at all. It is a long strip of bark paper, coated with white lime plaster, folded back and forth like an accordion. On its surface, Maya scribes painted rows of glyphs and images in black, red, and the faded traces of other colours. The pages are dense, busy, rhythmic, gods and numbers, day signs and serpents, all sharing the same narrow space. Scholars think it was made in the late post-classic period, perhaps around the 13th or 14th century, though it likely preserves much older traditions. By the time it was painted, Maya astronomy and calendar science had already been refined over many centuries of careful skywatching. Most of the codex is not astronomy in the modern detached sense. It is calendars of rituals and offerings, tables of Venus's appearances, lists of auspicious and dangerous days. It is, above all, a book about timing, when to plant, when to sacrifice, when to begin journeys or wars, when to stay inside and keep your head down. Within this tapestry of sacred time, a few sequences of pages stand out to modern eyes. They look at first glance like columns of numbers marching across the paper, interrupted by pictures of the moon, of deities, of strange creatures devouring or bleeding. These are the astronomy pages, and among them are the eclipse tables. Here the Maya did something that feels uncannily familiar if you have been following the story of Hipparchus and Ptolemy, yet it grows out of an entirely different philosophy of the sky. They noticed that lunar eclipses are not random. If you wait long enough, if you count carefully enough, patterns appear. There are certain intervals after which the geometry of sun, earth and moon repeats closely enough that eclipses tend to recur. Where a Greek astronomer might reach for circles and epicycles, Maya scribes reached for their own powerful tools, their vigesimal number system, their long count calendar, their knack for fitting cycles within cycles like gears in a hidden machine of time. On the eclipse pages of the Dresden Codex, you can see the result of that work, though you may not recognize it at first as science. Long columns of bar and dot numbers record counts of days. Small repeating glyphs mark intervals where eclipses are possible. The moon itself appears as a crescent, sometimes pierced, sometimes emerging from the jaws of a serpent or a monster. To someone trained in modern astrophysics, these pages look like a mixture of spreadsheet and nightmare. To the Maya, they were a map of danger. The scribes who painted these tables were not simply curious about when the shadow would touch the moon. They were responsible for something heavier, steering their community through stretches of time when the sky itself was expected to misbehave. The moon's dimming was not just a prediction problem. It was a crisis that reached into politics, agriculture, health, war, and the favour of the gods. So the eclipse tables of the Dresden Codex sit at a crossroads. On one side they are astonishing feats of naked eye observation and numerical pattern finding, rivaling anything in the old world. On the other they are woven directly into a system of omens and obligations. To mark an eclipse is to mark a moment when reality thins and the normal rules wobble. The Codex does not give you a neat clock time prediction, the way a modern ephemeris would. It offers something more ambiguous, and in some ways more unsettling, windows, stretches of days where shadow is more likely, and therefore where life needs to be handled differently. Those risky windows and what the Maya believed had to be done inside them are written between the numbers and the painted gods. To see how they used these tables, you have to step closer to the arithmetic itself, and to the quiet, relentless way they turned cycles in the sky into a schedule of earthly fear. If you follow the numbers down those narrow columns, past the snarling gods and the dripping serpents, a pattern slowly emerges. Not a circle every 18 years and 11 days with a Greek name attached. Something more like a drumbeat hidden inside a larger rhythm. The Maya knew, as many sky-watching cultures eventually noticed, that eclipses tend to gather in clusters. Lunar eclipses especially show up near certain alignments, then vanish again for a time. They don't hit every full moon. They stalk particular stretches of the calendar, like a predator pacing back and forth along a fence. So instead of trying to pinpoint one single night far in the future, the scribes built what we might call danger bands. A series of intervals, each one a warning. Here, in this slice of time, pay attention. Here, in this run of days, the moon is vulnerable, and therefore so are you. One of the famous sequences, as scholars reconstruct it, is a ladder of numbers separated by a fixed step. Each rung represents a count of days from one possible eclipse season to the next. At certain rungs, the scribe has tucked in a small glyph, a marker that might be glossed as eclipse seat or shadow station. You can imagine a priestly reader centuries ago running a finger down those marks, not thinking about inclinations and nodes, but about how many maize harvests, how many ritual rounds, how many dynastic anniversaries will pass before the next station of risk arrives. The counts themselves are fascinating. They don't just match one neat cycle. They mesh several. The synodic month, the time between full moons, the draconic month, the time it takes the moon to realign with the nodes of its orbit, those invisible crossing points where eclipses can occur. The Maya didn't have those modern terms, but they had the behaviour. They saw that eclipses only happen when a full moon crouches near one of those dangerous crossings, and so the tables knit together multiples of months that carry you from one vulnerable alignment to another. But they do it with a kind of generous fuzziness. The mark in the column doesn't say on this exact evening, at this exact hour, the dragon will bite. It says, sometime in this range you are inside the mouth. That ambiguity is not a failure. It is the point. For a naked eye observer without mechanical clocks, the sky does not move like a digital timetable. Clouds intervene. Horizons differ. Local weather and human error smear the boundary between on time and late. So the scribes took the natural spread of uncertainty and turned it into policy. They framed blocks of days as eclipse seasons. Go too narrow, and you miss the crisis. Go too wide, and the warning loses its edge. The tables walk that line. You can see this in the way some pages seem to highlight not a single date glyph, but a little neighbourhood of them surrounded by ominous imagery. The moon goddess bound or stabbed, a jaguar pouring a dark stream from a bowl, a skeletal deity brandishing weapons. These pictures are not there to decorate one instant. They are there to haunt a span. Inside that span, life is supposed to be lived differently. Corn might not be planted on the usual auspicious signs. Travel might be delayed. Certain ceremonies normally spaced out might be doubled or intensified. The court may take on a lower profile, postponing wars, postponing coronations, huddling metaphorically under a kind of celestial umbrella. We know some of this from colonial period descriptions of eclipse practices, recorded after the conquest, when many older traditions were already fraying. There are hints that communities would drum, shout, make noise to drive away the creature eating the moon, and that rulers were expected to oversee special offerings when the sky threatened to go wrong. But the codex itself suggests something more systemic. The very geometry of the tables pushes you to think in terms of windows, a recurring rotation of hot zones and cool zones, some years thick with alarm, others relatively gentle. In that sense, the eclipse pages are less like a list of storms and more like a calendar of hurricane seasons. They don't promise that every marked period will bring destruction. They say, if destruction comes, it will probably come here. Prepare accordingly. There is another twist, because the Maya calendar system is modular, with different cycles snapping into one another. These risky windows don't float free. They fall on particular named days, in particular named months, under the patronage of particular gods. So an eclipse season is never just around mid-August in some abstract astronomical sense. It is when the count returns to this day sign, ruled by this deity, carrying this charge. The danger is coloured by whatever qualities that combination already has in the ritual almanacs. If that day sign is associated with storms, then an eclipse season there might be read as a time of floods and tempests. If the month is linked to warfare, the same eclipse interval could be framed as a time when ambushes or rebellions are more likely. The celestial mechanics plug directly into a narrative about what kind of trouble the world is primed to deliver. Notice what this does. It means the scribes aren't just predicting shadows. They're choreographing expectation. They are telling their society in advance which stretches of the future will be normal, and which will be overlaid with a dim, anticipatory anxiety. On quiet nights, when the moon is full and bright, but the table says, "You're between danger bands," people can exhale. When the count rolls close to one of those glyph-marked stations, everyone knows, from farmers to war captains, that the margin for error has shrunk. Modern historians debate exactly how precise these predictions were across centuries, and how often the ritual schedule had to be tweaked when eclipses slipped just outside the predicted band. There are questions we can't yet answer, and perhaps never will. But the logic of windows is clear enough. The tables do not so much foretell a single blow as they chart the swinging arc of the hammer. And once you see that, another question emerges, one that goes beyond arithmetic. If you can map the ebb and flow of cosmic danger, who decides what must be done when the dangerous tide comes in? Before we follow that thread into ceremony, power, and the strange calm that rulers tried to project while the moon went dark, there's a quick note for you, listening in the dark. If you're the kind of person who likes lingering with unsolved patterns like these, there's a book about 12 unexplained mysteries you can get through the website, linked in the description. It dives into puzzles the way these scribes dove into their numbers. Because here, on these folded pages, the puzzle was no longer abstract. The next risky window was always approaching, marching closer with every mark the timekeepers carved or painted. And when the count said you were inside it, the entire city became a kind of waiting room, listening for the first hint that the edge of the world was about to dim. For most people in that waiting room, an eclipse was not a question for debate. It was a test, not of the moon of the people who claimed to stand between the city and whatever lived in the dark. Somewhere near the centre of town, in the palace or the temple complex, someone held the keys to the tables. A small group of calendar priests, trained for years to walk their minds through the intricate mesh of cycles, to keep long counts in their heads, to know exactly when the next danger band would close around the world. Their knowledge was not just intellectual, it was political capital. If you can say months or years in advance, a time of cosmic risk is coming, and then perform the right ceremonies while the sky behaves strangely, you become the hinge on which public fear swings. When the moon begins to dim, ordinary people can't tell whether it is dying properly, on schedule, or whether something has gone wrong with the fabric of time. But the priest who was pointed to that span in the Codex, who has told the ruler here between these signs we must be vigilant, can then stand in the plaza and say, this is the shadow we spoke of, this is why we prepared. This is one of the quiet powers of predictive astronomy. It lets those who hold it script the emotions of the crowd. In the lead-up to a risky window, that script might call for restraint. Less gambling, less travel, fewer big bets, a dampening of behaviour that could tip into chaos if the moon were to vanish without warning. But as the danger band opens, something else happens. The ritual calendar thickens. Offerings that might normally be made weekly are compressed. Bloodletting, that deeply personal act of piercing tongue or skin to feed the gods, becomes more urgent. The Codex itself, in some readings, pairs eclipse glyphs with intensified sacrificial scenes, bound captives, severed heads, streams flowing from blades. To a modern eye, these images can look like gratuitous horror. To the people who watched the moon go black, they were part of a bargain. If the heavens were capable of breaking pattern, of swallowing their own lights, then the only rational response was to shore up every other pattern you could control. Rites must be done exactly, debts must be paid, ancestors must be honoured. The ruler must be seen doing all of these things, because that ruler's legitimacy was in part lunar. Many Mesoamerican kings styled themselves as mediators between sky and earth, embodiments of order in a world that always threatened to slip back into primordial night. Their regalia echoed the sun and moon. Their genealogies traced descent from gods who once set the lights in motion. If an eclipse arrived within a danger window and the ceremonies were conducted properly, and the moon eventually returned full and bright, it was very easy to tell a story in which the ruler and his priests had helped pull it back. The Codex's tables, by mapping risk in advance, gave them a scaffold for that story. Before the moon darkened, they could declare fasts, demand offerings, summon subject towns to bring tribute for the coming trial. During the crisis, they could lead the noise-making in the prayers, position themselves at the visual and symbolic centre of the effort to restore the sky. Afterward, they could point to the surviving light and say, in effect, you were afraid, we were ready. Over time, those cycles of fear and reassurance become part of public order. Even if on some level people suspected the moon would always come back, the choreography of doing something together when it dimmed created social gravity. Everyone knew where to be, what to shout, what to avoid. The very act of following the script became a demonstration of loyalty. There's a subtler effect, too. When you divide time into safe stretches and dangerous ones, you can justify different rules for each. A tax or labour draft might be framed as necessary because the next eclipse season is near. A postponement of a festival, a delay in distributing stored maize, can be wrapped in the language of prudence. Better to be cautious while the moon's path is unstable. In that way, eclipse fears seep into economic decisions, legal judgments, even warfare. Some scholars think certain campaigns were either launched or held back, depending on where the army would be when a predicted risky window opened. An eclipse seen in your own capital, with your own ceremonies in control, is one thing. An eclipse catching your troops on foreign ground, under foreign gods, could look like a cosmic veto. So the tables in the Dresden Codex are not just about watching the sky. They are blueprints for managing human volatility under a recurring, predictable anxiety. Every time the scribes followed those counts and marked another danger band, they were doing more than aligning themselves with the draconic month. They were re-inscribing a pattern in which the community learns to expect fear on a schedule, and to resolve it through shared practice and obedience to ritual authority. From the outside, centuries later, we can read those pages like math problems solved in red and black ink. Multiples of months, careful columns, a quiet insistence that nothing in the heavens is entirely random. From the inside, in a city where children grew up hearing that the moon could be eaten if the rites were neglected, those same columns must have felt like a promise that someone was watching. Someone had a plan, someone knew when the next unsettling night would arrive. In that sense, the most important thing the eclipse tables predicted was not the shadow itself. It was the moment when thousands of people would look up together, hold their breath, and then look back down, waiting to see whether the old bargains with the sky still held. By tying those moments to ceremony and power, the Dresden Codex turns eclipses from isolated shocks into pulses in a larger rhythm, each one measuring how well a fragile order can hold its shape while the light fades, and then slowly returns. 7. The medieval blood moon in Chronicles and sermons shift, now from painted bark books and stepped pyramids to stone churches and chilled damp fields. The fear is the same, the script is different. In the Latin West, the moon was no longer catalogued in folding codices of bark and lime, but in narrow columns of ink between prayers and battle lists. Monks and clerks, huddled over wooden desks, wrote in the same hand about ploughing seasons, coronations, and nights when the moon rose wrong. If you read enough of those chronicles in a row, a pattern starts to flicker. Normal moons barely get a mention. Strange moons stop the pen. Again and again the careful, almost bored record of such and such a king reigned this many pigs were paid in tax suddenly tightens, and in that year the moon was turned to blood. They had a whole vocabulary for it. Sometimes it is rubicunda, reddened, sometimes sanguinea, blood-like. Sometimes they reach for fire instead, igneas orbis, a fiery disk, or quasi inflammis ardens, as if burning in flames. The colour is always wrong, and so is the time. One English chronicle, looking back on a year choked with bad harvests, pauses to note a moon that for nearly the whole night did not shine with its accustomed light, but appeared as if suffused with blood. Another on the continent recalls a feast of a major saint when the moon should have hung full and bright above processions, but instead rose late and dark, and when it cleared it was as red as fresh spilled gore. The timing matters because medieval people, perhaps more than we do, lived inside the calendar. Every week, every month, every year was stitched together by feasts, fasts, vigils. There were nights when you expected the moon to be high and helpful, lighting the way to a festival or an early mass. There were nights when you expected darkness, as Lent deepened or as winter swallowed the day. When the moon disobeyed that choreography, the dissonance was visceral. Imagine having walked the same path from village to church for 20 years, knowing exactly how the full moon falls between two roof lines on the hill, and then 1 year stepping outside to see that familiar wheel turned copper, or failing to rise at all until most of the night is gone. Chronicles preserve that shock in short, cramped lines, often tied to precise moments. On the calends of May, in the first week of Advent, during the night before the Lord's Ascension. The sky is not just strange, it is offbeat, out of step with sacred time. Sometimes they describe the change as gradual, like a wound spreading. One scribe in Germany notes that the moon was first pale, then yellow, then little by little darkened, until at last it appeared wholly blood-coloured. Another claims the reverse, that the moon rose already as blood, and by degrees recovered its former brightness, as if washing clean. These are the voices of people watching the same physical phenomenon we would now pass as atmosphere and alignment, but they are not doing physics. They are doing diagnosis, and the moon is a patient that keeps changing colour. Many writers seem to have been especially disturbed when the redness lingered. A brief tarnishing could be chalked up as a curiosity. A whole night transformation felt like a statement. One Norman chronicler, already nervous about border raids and rumours of famine, records that for 3 successive nights the moon shone not white, but deep red, to the great terror of the people. Another, writing in Italy, remembers a sequence where for several months the moon was often seen darkened and ruddy even when no clouds covered it, a pattern he folds into a list of unrest and earthquakes. They were not just tracking hue, they were watching the moon's schedule slip. You find notes about moons that rise late, as though someone has dragged them backward along their path. Moons that appear oddly small yet intensely coloured, as if shrunken and bruised. In one Irish annal, the writer remarks that the moon seemed nearer to the earth than was its custom, and its face was red. That closeness, real or imagined, makes the redness feel less like a distant sign and more like a presence overhead. The language is often medical, even when the metaphor is martial. A sick moon, a wounded moon, a stricken moon, a disk injured by blood, diseased by redness. You can sense them groping for ways to say, this is not how a healthy sky behaves. Preachers picked up the same vocabulary. We meet their voices not just in chronicles, but in sermon collections and moral treatises, where a remembered blood-tinted moon becomes a ready example. A homilist might recall the year when the moon was as blood at the mid-hour of the night, using that eerie timing to anchor a warning about sin ripening in secret. Midnight, in a monastic schedule, is when the community rises to chant the night office. A blood moon at that hour cuts right across their routine. The time that should be quiet, regulated, familiar, suddenly holds a red-stained light. Even where the timing is imprecise, the contrast is clear. Some texts stress that the moon was red, though the air was clear, or that it glowed like blood, when no storm or cloud was seen. They are doing an early form of control experiment, removing ordinary causes so that the remaining strangeness demands an explanation. That insistence that this happened on a clear night, at a holy season, at an hour when things ought to be stable, gives the event a sharp edge. It lets later readers feel the same unease. If even the moon, that slow, patient keeper of months, can break pattern and bleed across the sky, what else might be about to slip? Those questions, and the ways medieval writers tried to answer them, reached far beyond a single strange evening. They were folded into prophecies, woven into political rhetoric, turned into stories about why certain kings rose and others fell. Sermons learned to lean on those nights of red light as examples, as leverage on the conscience. And while we now have our own shelves of explanations, from eclipse tables to volcanic aerosols, the medieval habit of seeing a message in every discoloured moon did not disappear. It evolved, if you've ever wondered how those interpretations shaped real decisions, who went to war, who stayed home, who fasted, who feasted. That's where we're heading next. But before we watch blood-tinted moons steer politics and preaching, we need to spend a little more time inside the mindset that made those colours so charged, and glance at how other mysteries of the sky were being catalogued and debated in the same centuries. And if lying here listening you find yourself wanting to follow these threads further, out beyond the moon into other strange lights and forgotten panics, there's a book of 12 unexplained mysteries you can find through the website linked in the description. For now, keep that image in mind. A Europe of small firelit communities, a sky that mostly behaves, and every so often a night when the familiar pale lantern rises the colour of spilled wine and refuses to look normal no matter how long you stare. From where we sit with weather satellites and eclipse calculators, it is tempting to tidy all of this up. You can almost hear a modern voice leaning over the shoulder of that anxious Norman chronicler, saying gently, It was just the Earth's shadow, just dust, just smoke, and in a certain sense that's true. Many of those blood moons, especially the ones described as slow to change, as if a stain spreading across the disk, were almost certainly total lunar eclipses. The Earth slipping between sun and moon, the planet's own bulk casting a shadow that wraps the moon in darkness, and then, strangely, in red. If you've ever watched one, you know the sequence. The familiar bright face begins to dim, not all at once, but as if someone were sliding an invisible lid across it. The shadow curls from one edge inward, the light shrinks to a thin, hard crescent. And then, when the moon is fully inside the Earth's shadow, it doesn't vanish. It glows, not white, not grey, copper, rust, old wine, a colour that lives right between ember and bruise. We understand now that the red is our own atmosphere bending sunlight around the Earth and up onto the moon's surface. The blue light gets scattered away, the red threads through, filtered through layers of air, dust and cloud. The moon becomes a vast, silent projection screen for every sunrise and sunset happening at that instant around the edge of the world. For a medieval watcher in a field, none of that was obvious. All they knew was that the moon could, on certain nights, be seen to darken without clouds, be gnawed away by some invisible curve, then hang there stained the colour of blood. The very slowness of it, the way the change took its time, made it feel deliberate. Not a flash, but a process. Other nights, the redness had a different source. A moon that rises low on the horizon always looks larger and more coloured, because its light has to fight through far more atmosphere to reach you. If that air is loaded with dust from a summer of ploughing dry fields, from a sand-laden wind out of the east, from the constant smoke of hearths and kilns, the effect is stronger. The blue and green parts of the light are stripped away, the red slips through. Add in a dry spell, when fields are scuffed into powder, or a season of building when lime is being burnt, stone is being cut, fortifications are being thrown up along a nervous border. Each hammer stroke, each cart rolling, shakes a little more grit into the sky. You stand at the edge of the village one evening, look up, and the full moon clearing the trees has a sickly iron-red rim. No shadow, no slow bite taken from one side, just a wrong-coloured lantern, as if the world itself has opened its ovens and let the heat out. Then there are the years when something far larger than plough or kiln is at work. Volcanoes halfway around the world, throwing ash and sulphur into the stratosphere. We can track some of those now with ice cores and tree rings, colossal eruptions in the 6th century, the 13th, the 15th. Each one lofted a veil of particles high above the weather, where they lingered, scattering and absorbing sunlight for months or years. In those years, people talked about a dim sun, about dry fog that never quite cleared, about seasons that felt off. And when the moon rose full through that high, thin haze, its light would be weakened and reddened, like a candle behind smoked glass. Chroniclers tell us of moons seen darkened and ruddy even when no clouds covered it. To us that sounds like a textbook description of a sky thinly laced with volcanic aerosol. No obvious storm, no nearby fire, just a subtle global filter laid across the light. Wildfires can do something similar on a smaller scale. A forest burning in late summer, a peat bog smouldering under dry grass, a swath of heathland accidentally set alight. None of these has to be visible from the monastery wall to change what the monks see above it. Smoke can drift hundreds of miles, an invisible river at altitude. By day, that smoke softens the sun, makes it look pale or orange. By night, it tangles with the moon's rays and pulls them toward red. People in one valley might have perfectly clear stars overhead and still watch the moon rise as if soaked in blood, thanks to a distant, unseen blaze. We can, in retrospect, map some of these things together. A chronicle that notes great fires in the forests in one line, and, a few weeks later, a moon of horrible redness. An entry that pairs earthquakes in many regions with a year of dim, discoloured skies that we can correlate with some faraway eruption. A series of eclipses that we can date with orbital mechanics and match to those remembered nights of creeping shadow and copper light. None of this cancels the old dread. If anything, it sharpens it. Because now we can see how intimately those blood-coloured moons were braided with the very disasters that frightened their watchers, with famines following bad harvests under veiled skies, with plagues moving along roads lit by ruddy, low moons, with wars waged in the uneasy half-light of eclipses and smoke. The same physical causes that turned the moon red were often also stressing crops, cooling summers or drying forests to tinder. To a medieval mind, that bundle of effects, failed grain, coughing children, strange light, could only mean one thing. The heavens were speaking. In the next breath of the story, that conviction begins to harden into policy. Rulers ask what the sky is demanding. Preachers insist they know. And the blood-tinted moon that we might casually photograph and forget becomes, for them, a kind of deadline in the sky. When you believe a light in the sky is a deadline, you start arranging your life around it, in royal halls. That often meant council meetings that suddenly felt like confessions. There are stories from across Europe of kings who, after a red moon or a darkened sun, summoned bishops and abbots and asked, in tones that hover somewhere between fear and calculation, what exactly God wanted them to change. The answers were rarely simple. Sometimes the prescription was moral. Chroniclers tell us of rulers urged to abandon certain taxes, to free captives, to restore lands taken from the church. The sky, in these sermons, had become a kind of cosmic marginal note. Repay your debts, mend your injustices, while there is still time. Other times the message was sharper, more convenient for the men in the pulpit. If a kingdom was already drifting toward war, a blood-tinted moon could be drafted into service as a divine signature. Preachers would stand before uneasy crowds and declare that the crimson light was proof that God had armed the heavens in favour of their Lord, or that the stain on the moon showed the enemy's guilt. The same sign could, in another town, under another roof, be read in the opposite way. That was the unsettling thing about sky signs, their ambiguity. A copper moon before a battle could be taken as a warning that the campaign was unjust, or as a promise that the unjust would soon be punished. If plague followed, one side could say the warning had been ignored. If victory followed, the other side could say the omen had been fulfilled. So interpretation itself became a kind of power. To stand up after a strange night and say with confidence, "This is what it means," was to claim authority not just on earth, but at the seam between earth and heaven. Princes needed that. So did city councils, so did frightened villagers trying to decide whether to flee a region, to hoard grain, to make vows. Sermons from the period make it clear how often that need was met. A preacher might begin with a passage from Joel or Revelation. The moon shall be turned to blood, and then slide, with practised ease, into yesterday's sky. He would remind his listeners of their shared memory, how they had stood in the fields or in the churchyard, murmuring as the moon climbed up, wrong-coloured. He would let that unease rise again in their chests. Then he would offer a channel for it. Repent. Give alms. Join this fast, this procession, this crusade. In that way, fear of the signs above did not stay in the realm of private dread. It flowed down into very specific acts. Coins dropped into chests, oaths sworn, troops levied, alliances sealed or broken. Even when nothing dramatic followed, the memory stayed. A chronicle might note an uneventful year framed by a terrifying eclipse at the start and a poor harvest at the end, with everything in between coloured by the expectation that something worse was coming. That expectation could slow trade, as merchants hesitated to send cargoes out under angry skies. It could hasten judgments as local courts rushed to resolve disputes before the wrath of heaven falls. The sky, in other words, became part of the political calendar. It wasn't just fixed feasts and movable fasts that shaped the rhythm of decision-making. It was rumours of a coming conjunction, an anticipated eclipse traced in a monk's margin, a memory of the last time the moon rose dark. Leaders were nudged quietly but persistently by the thought that the next strange light might arrive before they had put their souls and their kingdoms in order. Over the centuries, that habit of mind left a deep trace. When a red moon appears in a medieval narrative, it rarely stands alone. It comes braided into a story about reforming laws or launching campaigns or calling councils to heal religious splits. The heavens provide the deadline, human beings supply the agenda. And yet, inside that machinery of influence, something simpler is still visible. A peasant woman looking up from her field, a child tugging at a sleeve and asking why the moon looks hurt, a clerk pausing over his parchment to step outside and stare. For a moment, whatever the preachers and princes will later say, there is only the shared shock of seeing a familiar thing made strange. In that small silence between the sight and the explanation lies the thread that links them to us. We no longer build sermons on eclipses, at least not in the same way. Our politics are less likely to pivot on the colour of the moon and more on the charts of economists and polls. The omens have changed, but the reflex to look at the sky for hints about what is coming, to suspect that the world might be telling us something through its own light and shadow, that is harder to shed. It is there in the way headlines still talk about signs of the times, in the way some people read patterns into storms and heat waves, in the uneasy thrill many feel when the moon does, now and then, rise red. Which brings us back to our theme. Across all these centuries and cultures, the moon is not just a rock reflecting sunlight. It is a surface on which human fears, hopes and warnings have been projected. A changing face that seemed to look back. In the last part of our journey, we'll step away from any single tradition and ask what all these stories taken together might be hinting at. And if you ever want to sink even deeper into this kind of twilight history, there's a book waiting for you. 12 Unexplained Mysteries, collected on our website, with a link down in the description. For now, let the medieval blood moons fade behind your eyes. The sky is dark, the world is quiet, and the moon, whatever it really is, keeps turning its many stories toward us, one strange soft night at a time. If you trace your way back through this journey, certain scenes linger. Plutarch, calmly suggesting that the moon might be another kind of earth, a borderland where souls migrate and storms of a different sort roll over invisible seas. The authors of Enoch watching the moon wander off its expected route and deciding that this wasn't just an astronomical quirk, but a sign that the very law of the heavens could be bent or broken when justice on earth went wrong. The Babylonian scholars hunched over clay, turning every missing sliver and oddly timed eclipse into a sentence in a language only gods and trained men could read. Chinese courtiers beating drums while an invisible dragon devoured the light. Maya scribes copying eclipse tables into the Dresden Codex with the same care you would give to a map of dangerous reefs. Medieval preachers weaving a red moon into sermons that could shift coins, troops and consciences. Different empires, different myths, different calculations. The pattern underneath is the same. Whenever the moon stopped behaving as expected, people didn't just stare. They listened, They treated its changeable face as a message, sometimes from gods, sometimes from fate, sometimes from the hidden mechanics of the universe itself. We now describe those mechanics with orbits and angles. We can predict eclipses centuries in advance. The dragon has become a diagram. But even with all that, a strange moon still tugs at something older in us. A reminder that we live on a small world under larger cycles and that certainty is always thinner than it feels. If you'd like to drift through more of that twilight space between science and story, you can always find the Book of 12 Unexplained Mysteries on our website. The link is in the description. For now, if this helped you rest, or kept you company in the dark, it would mean a lot if you'd like this video. Subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling us where in the world you're listening from tonight. And if you want to support this kind of long, quiet history the most, the best place to do that is by listening on Spotify. The link is down there in the description too. Close your eyes if you haven't already. Outside, whether you can see it or not, the moon is still there. Not quite what our ancestors thought it was. Not quite what we think it is yet. Just a moving light over a restless planet, waiting for the next pair of eyes to look up and wonder,